What the sisters say. It's the calculation test. Thank you very much.
Lawton and Altus are both unmuted, just so you know.
Okay, Elk City and Lawton. I see you all. Are y'all ready to go? Y'all can wave if you are.
We're ready.
Okay. Well, good morning. How are y'all doing? Can I get my students to close our doors? You don't mind? Thank you. It gets kind of loud in the hallway. Okay, well, if we're ready to get started, we will. So we're going to be in chapter 25, starting out today. Suicide and non-suicidal self-injury. I'm going to go ahead and switch over to computer screen. This is the PowerPoint that was in Moodle for you. That's from your book. I added a few different slides. So I'm going to go to computer. Can y'all see that? I don't think you can. Or maybe.
We see your computer screen.
Oh, you do? Okay, good. I'm sorry. Okay. Okay. So I know this test, I don't think y'all did as well as the first test. And this was a more difficult test. So just to we'll be getting into our chapter as I talk here just briefly. Do you all, when you're looking at your book and reading your book in entirety, do you really look at the objectives that are in the beginning of the chapter? And then as you're reading through your book, do you jot down notes? Do you especially do you jot down notes in answering those questions of your objectives? I won't make anybody raise their hands or anything. I can't see the other campuses right now. But just keep in mind that is one just kind of good way to study. And you really should be reading the chapters before we come to class. I know that is a little bit difficult, especially when you have your big test that day and then we go into new chapters after the test. It's difficult to read, especially those chapters. But otherwise, you should be reading the chapters before class. So those are maybe just a couple of maybe tips on maybe how to help you study better, okay? So for chapter 25, we're going to go ahead and go into this. And let's look at those objectives. We want to summarize the profile of suicide in the United States, noting any psychosocial and cultural factors that affect risk. We need to outline risk factors for suicide, including coexisting psychiatric disorders. And probably already, even if maybe you have not read the chapter, from our previous lectures, you're already thinking of a couple of different maybe psychiatric type nursing or medical diagnoses that do put a person at risk then for a higher risk, I should say, for suicide. Just off the top of your head, what are maybe two diagnoses that come to mind? When you're thinking, no, that's a nursing diagnosis, I'm sorry. A medical diagnosis, I'm sorry, what'd you say?
Depression, bipolar.
Right, those are three, yeah. Very good, depression, bipolar, and schizophrenia. We'll talk especially, I know, about depression and schizophrenia as far as an increased risk, causing an increased risk for suicide here in just a minute. Name the most frequent coexisting psychiatric disorders. Okay, we already talked associated with suicidal ideation. Okay, so those are just kind of briefly, and there are a few more in your book, but that's kind of what we'll be talking about today. So first of all, I'm going to go ahead and read this. Just remember, when we're talking about suicide, if we're taking care of patients who are at risk for suicide, maybe there was an attempt at suicide. Remember, you are taking care, of course, of the patient, but then also remember friends and family, especially if you are dealing maybe with a situation where maybe the patient, for whatever reason, has committed suicide. And for whatever reason, you are now having to deal with a family. That family now is your patient as well. And the impact of suicide, not only on the person, but on friends and family surrounding that person. And in your book, it starts out on page 475. It says, "Dearest Adam, it's hard to believe that a year has gone by. The void created by your departure fills me with such emptiness. While echoes of your laughter linger, urging me and those whose lives you touch to press forward, living life to the fullest, seizing and celebrating each moment. I am so grateful to you to have been blessed with a son such as you. 26, almost 27 years for so fleeting a time, over in what seems to be like a heartbeat. I purpose my life toward building your future, creating possibility in your life, living vicariously through you, as you often expressed. So many questions remain. Golden moments flash across my mind. Your warmth, your charm, the love you shared, the depth of your character, the contagious ardor with which you embraced your passions. Impossible to capture in mere words. You were loved, adored, and admired. You were so ardent and able. I was so proud of you and cherished you with all my being. Love, Mom." So it's just, I don't know, I just thought it was a very, very well-written message expressing the love for her son, obviously the wonderful characteristics that her son had, you know. A lot of times these patients who are near suicide, suicidal ideation, thinking that way, attempting suicide, possibly committing suicide, a lot of times are not just these, maybe you think, dark people that have all these dark negative thoughts. A lot of times that's not the case. Maybe in the later months leading up to it, maybe so, but often that's not the case at all. In your book, it continues to say that suicide is devastating for those of us who lose a family member or friend. What brings a person to such a drastic and permanent solution to life's problems? As unimaginable this act is to many of us, human life ends every 13 minutes as a result of suicide. It's leading to the loss of approximately 113 Americans' lives daily. So I guess somewhere, across our nation today, approximately 113 people will be ending their lives. And that's the ones who actually succeed. What about all of the ones who are attempting suicide? The number is much, much greater than that. So definitely suicide is definitely an important issue for us to talk about. There are different terms that you need to understand, which are pretty much self-explanatory, but just make sure you kind of understand the difference. Suicide itself, of course, is the intentional act of killing oneself by any means. Then suicidal ideation, this is thinking about killing oneself. Of course, a completed suicide is suicides that does result in death. I don't like the word successfully there, but that is the right word, I guess, to use, but it does result in death. A non-suicidal injury is self-injury directed to the surface of the body to induce relief from a negative feeling, cognitive state, and or to achieve a positive mood state. And we'll talk about that near the end of this chapter just briefly, but about those injuries that sometimes maybe persons do kind of put upon themselves, physical injuries such as cutting, maybe burning themselves, etc. And it's really, if you don't have those thoughts, it doesn't make sense at all. But sometimes the type of self-induced injury is used to either they feel so numb that they have to do that to feel like they can actually feel something, or kind of almost the opposite, they do it to block pain. So we'll talk a little bit more about that here in just a minute. It's definitely really, it is preventable. It should never be considered. It should be considered a never event. In the year before their deaths, 83% of the individuals received either inpatient or outpatient healthcare services, and approximately half of those who die by suicide did not have a mental health diagnosis. And that's in page 475 of your text. And a lot of these patients probably should have had some type of mental health diagnosis. I think we've kind of talked about that throughout since we started this unit on mental health, but how mental health, we don't have really enough resources and avenues for people to seek help when they do need it. People are underdiagnosed with mental health disorders. Part of that is because of those lack of access, but part of it is also that stigma related to mental health. So as healthcare providers, we need to work both on that level where we're working at, but also on a community level, even maybe a national level, on helping others recognize that mental health, a diagnosis of mental health disorders should not be a stigma, that those people need help. It's just like any kind of illness. If we had heart disease or if we have lung disease, the brain is a very, very complex organ, and it can physically have its own problems. Unfortunately, those problems, of course, are manifested through how we approach life, what we say to people, how we act, how we feel. And so that's why, of course, it becomes mental health. And then, of course, that's why then that negative stigma is associated with it. So anyway, so going on in your book, there's just one more thing I wanted to mention. It's under epidemiology on 475 in the second paragraph. In 2014, attempted suicide or suicidal ideation led to approximately 470,000 annual visits to the emergency room. So kind of with that just being said, a lot of times, where are we going to see patients with mental health disorders? In the ER. I know a few of you probably have worked in ER, maybe through like a nurse tech type situation. And you probably have seen how many times you really are running into people with mental health problems, even though maybe they don't have that diagnosis of mental health disorders. So at least 470,000 annual visits to the ER, and outcomes may be catastrophic for the individual. I mean, it gives a little example there of a person who tried to commit suicide. He had schizophrenia. It's really kind of, I'll just read it. It's kind of gruesome. Consider the case of a young man with schizophrenia with deep depression and confusion. He takes a medication overdose. He kneels down in front of his couch to pray for forgiveness as he dies. His father finds him near death. He calls the paramedics. The young man lives, but due to being in a kneeling position for so long, the circulation to his legs was severely compromised, and it resulted in the amputation of his legs. Okay, and then of course from that point on, long-term life disability. So that's just an example of, it was a near suicide. He did not complete the suicide, but he still ended up having physical complications from that. And you will see that at times in different people. And also just to remember that we probably are not seeing statistically all of the people who do attempt suicide. A lot of times people do take those pills and they go to bed hoping that they don't wake up. And they didn't take enough pills to cause death, and they do wake up. And so we don't see that reported in some of our statistics. So the number, of course, is much higher. Going on to looking at epidemiology, we already covered a few of those facts, but it is the 10th leading cause of U.S. deaths. For the ages of those who are from the age of 10 to 34, it is the actual second leading cause of death in America. So what if we could somehow decrease that rate? What an impact it would have on those ages especially. It's the fourth leading cause of death for ages 35 to 54. It's the 8th leading cause of death for ages 55 to 64. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Well, actually, I'll go ahead so I won't forget. I'll just give you 2 examples that I personally have witnessed over the last several years. In those suicidal ideations and attempted suicides in older people. And these both occurred at the hospital, at Jackson County Memorial Hospital. It was on a New Year's Eve, and I may have shared this story with some of you, but I got a report early that morning on New Year's Day, but I think it was right around midnight. One of my nurses walked into, this was almost director of skilled nursing. So one of the nurses on skilled nursing walked into a patient's room about midnight just to do her normal, routine, check on the patients. He had taken the SCD, the sequential compression device, that cord, and he had wrapped it around his neck, and he was attempting to strangle himself. And he really was attempting to strangle himself. I don't think he was strong enough to do it. I don't know. But anyway, of course, he became immediately, he was attempting suicide. So we immediately initiated suicide precautions, and we were able to transfer him to a different facility the next day. So that's just one example right there in the hospital. And then there was another gentleman in the hospital who I think he did not attempt suicide while in the hospital, but when he was visiting with a social worker, he was talking about he really did wish to end his life. So of course they were talking to him further at that point, and he did have a plan, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. He wanted to, he very vividly said he was going to go and sit on a porch when he got home. He was going to wait till a certain time of the day when nobody was around, and he had a gun. He did have a gun, and he was going to use that gun to end his life. So at that point, he became then, we put him on suicidal precautions with one-on-one being observation, etc. And we did get him counseling and stuff. But and this gentleman was I can't remember, he was over the age of 70, I know. He had started having just some long-term health problems that he felt like he was a burden to his wife. He talked about how wonderful his wife was and how she had put up with him for all those years, and that he just didn't want her to have to go through anything else with him. That was kind of his reasons that he was verbalizing. So it isn't just a disease or something that is seen in younger people. It is seen in people of all ages. We know now that we're seeing more suicidal attempts and completed suicides in our military people, those who are serving our country, especially those who maybe do serve over in another country for a while and come back here. Those with PTSD, there are definitely increased risk of a suicidal ideation with those people. So that's a very important aspect to consider. There's a box on page 25, I'm sorry, on page 476. It's that suicidal facts, 25.1. I want you to just take about 2 minutes, read through that, and answer these questions. I'll let y'all do that on your own. Y'all can read. We'll take about 2 minutes to do that. Okay, it may not have been quite 2 minutes, but I'm getting nervous sitting here. So I'm really anxious today. I don't know why. But anyway, so maybe it's the subject matter. So for our first question, I'll go ahead and ask Lawton the first 2 questions there. So Lawton, how many more males than females commit suicide?
4 times.
Okay, yeah. So that's very significant. And the second one, what method of committing suicide is most often used?
Firearms.
Firearms. Very good. And that is pretty, a lot of times, now that this is, I'm not sure if this is in your book, if you're very serious about completing the act, often firearms are used. Sometimes when maybe you're just wanting to get help, sometimes pills are used. That's what people have said. Now, that's not necessarily in the book, and definitely overdoses do kill many people. So don't get me wrong when I'm saying that, but sometimes I've heard when people come in to the emergency room after an overdose, we kind of consider them crying for help, with that act. So they really didn't want to end their life. They just needed to somehow reach out and say, hey, I need help. Okay, so what about Elk City? How does suicide rank as the cause of death for American Indians and Alaskan Natives? Go ahead.
Second leading cause of death.
Okay, secondly. Okay, so very significant, of course, in all populations, but it's also in the American Indian and Alaskan Native population. There is and I don't know a whole lot about it, but if you read information on depression, use of alcohol, it's very, very high in Alaskan Natives. It's true for American Natives as well. I'm sorry, American Indians and Alaskan Natives. I have a cousin who she's actually getting her PhD in psychology. I don't get to talk to her that often, but she grew up in Texas, but she is part Eskimo, and she's been spent the last about 8 years of her life in Alaska, working with people who the local, I guess, what is it? Alaskan Natives there, and she's very concerned with that population because of the high rate of depression. Part of that is due to just the environment, and you'll probably, I don't know if we'll actually talk about it, but seasonal affective disorder, where because it is dark many months out of the year, that can end
There's probably many.
causing some depression, and of course, just for other related factors, poverty, use of alcohol, all kind of play into that increased risk for depression with Alaskan Natives. It's real interesting.
Our colleges and students in Alaska, because of course they get scholarships and stuff like that to attend state universities, so there was a lot of them in my classes. And they said that like a big reason for that, like this, they have suicide and depression and stuff, is because they grow up in these villages that are really, really rural, that you can get to by a plane, that's it. And their education system out there isn't very good. So then they come to town and it's a whole entire overwhelming experience for them to come to society.
That makes sense.
And then they're not successful because they didn't really get that good of an education. So then they're having to start in like the pre-basics classes and stuff to try and catch up and things like that. It was interesting to talk about one of my psychology classes up there to hear some Native students.
So one of my students was saying, and you probably, hopefully you heard that. She was just saying she lived for a while in Alaska, and so she had some kind of experience observing students. A lot of these students, and of course a lot of these villages are very isolated because of the geography of Alaska, the weather of Alaska, and so they end up getting scholarships. They go to these big universities. They've never really been to outside of their village. The education systems within the villages aren't maybe as good as maybe in the bigger cities. So they get to these big cities. They don't exactly know what to do. They go to school. They find that they're very behind. And so that is just probably one of the reasons why there's an increased risk of depression and other disorders, problems in that state. So.
And the villages are dry.
Oh, the villages are dry, so there's no alcohol. Then they get to the big city and there's alcohol now, and then they're a little bit depressed because maybe they're not doing well in school, and then they drink. And very interesting. Okay. We've already kind of answered this question. Do older people attempt suicide? Definitely. And for those who attempt suicide, how many do in their lives? I think that was just a general question. I'm sorry, say it again.
1 in 25.
1 in 25. So 100. So we could do the math. We said approximately 113 people will end their lives today statistically with suicide. Multiply that then by 25. Does somebody have a calculator? Can y'all do that for me? No one has a calculator? So 2,825 people will attempt suicide today. I mean, that's a way of looking at it, I guess, approximately. So across our nation. Okay. So, and then what percentage of high school students have contemplated suicide? Just thought about it. 17% of high school students. That's really a large number, right? So out of 100 students, 17 have at least contemplated suicide. That's a very large number when you really think about it. So that is a very good area where, of course, and of course we do that. Probably we need to do more of that in schools, but really trying to deter those thoughts. We want, and you do that by building up a person's self-esteem, by identifying factors that maybe cause that suicidal ideation. And we'll talk more about it maybe here in a minute, but what are a couple things that you can think that can happen maybe in the junior high, high schools, even elementary schools really, that can cause maybe somebody to end up thinking about suicidal thoughts? Bullying is what it comes to my mind. Yeah. When I was preparing this chapter last night, I was watching some of the videos, and I don't think I posted those, but just on bullying and then suicide, and it's just very staggering what you can learn, and how bad bullying is. Okay. So here's a case study, and this kind of leads into a little bit of that bullying. We have Gino, a 14-year-old, identifies as a transgender, saying, "I have known since I was real little that I was meant to be a girl. I'm a girl on the inside and always have been. As soon as I'm of age, I'm going to get surgery for gender reassignment. I've been saving my money for it as long as I can remember. In the meantime, I asked my friends to call me Gina instead of Gino. I grew up with these same kids, so with my friends, it's really no big deal. However, now things are changing for Gina. Growing up in a small neighborhood school in the city, she has now entered a newer, larger school. She doesn't always have classes with her friends, and she's beginning to get pushed around in the halls. Recently, Gina, who dresses and grooms herself as a girl, tried to use the girls' bathroom, which was allowed for her at the small private school. A teacher followed her in and shooed her back out, calling her disgusting." So with that being said, then now we're probably now worried about Gina here as having maybe feeling pressure, being depressed because now what was accepted by her friends as normal for her and okay, now it's kind of being challenged. And so that could lead to, some people might even consider a few of those actions definitely bullying. And so possibly now she's at an increased risk for suicidal ideation. Okay, so now let's go into, we're kind of on page 276 there. We've already mentioned this before, but psychiatric disorders. What puts you at a higher risk for suicidal ideation? And we've already mentioned that the first one that your book talks about is depression. We're on the bottom of page 476 there. Depression is the diagnosis most commonly associated with suicide. Approximately 50% of those who complete suicide are experiencing depression at the time of the death. So depression. And I believe, and I don't go to the doctor very often, so I guess I don't really see it that much. But I do know the last time I went, which was a few years ago, are they screening now with every doctor's visit for depression? Have y'all seen that to be true?
I've noticed it like on paperwork they fill out before you go in.
Okay.
Usually every time, well, and especially on base, they ask, are you having any suicidal or homicidal ideation? Have you been feeling down or have you lost interest in things that in the last week, or are you having problems sleeping?
Okay. So she, just one of the students is saying that when she maybe goes to the clinic, and especially on a military base, that there are definitely, and I think this is true really in the civilian world as well, there are questions, at least if nothing else, on a piece of paper that you're answering before you go in to visit the physician or maybe the nurse practitioner, questions related to depression, and also suicidal thoughts. So this is, we are taking note of this in the medical world, and we are taking some measures to try to recognize depression early on, okay? If you go on to the next paragraph, it then talks about schizophrenia. It says individuals with a diagnosis of schizophrenia have an 8-fold increased risk than those in the general population, especially during the first few years of the illness. So again, very, very impactful statistics there to me. So those, especially those newly diagnosed with schizophrenia, or maybe if it even hasn't been recognized as schizophrenia yet, they have an 8-fold increase of risk of suicide compared to those members of the population without schizophrenia. It is the leading cause of early death in this population. Okay. Remember, we said when we talked about schizophrenia that that they have a life expectancy that's much shorter than those without schizophrenia. And one of that points to one of the reasons for that is the leading cause of early death in this population. Up to 13% of these people die from suicide, usually related to depressive symptoms rather than to command hallucinations or delusions. So it's not, maybe at times it is a command hallucination or a delusion causing that person to commit suicide, but oftentimes it's just the depressive symptoms of the disease. And then it goes on to talk a little bit about those with substance disorders. Patients with substance use disorders who use both legal and illicit substances have a higher suicide risk. Years of substance use and comorbidity with depression are factors associated with increased risk. Many individuals who die by suicide have alcohol in their blood at the time of death and have used an illicit substance in the days before their death. Alcohol, a depressant, tends to dull one's senses, and individuals who are otherwise ambivalent about whether to end their lives may act on suicidal thoughts because of that dullness of the senses from the alcohol or the other drug use or abuse. Okay, and keep in mind, it's not just illegal drugs, it is also legal drugs. That is why I think over the last probably year especially, but the last several years, we have seen more and more information upon the abuse of opiates. Okay, especially when you see patients in the hospital setting, and that's what we see, right? Especially as we're doing our clinicals, and you see those patients who have, especially I think about the total knee surgeries, the total hip surgeries, this knee surgeries especially. I mean, those individuals really have high levels of pain, and that pain needs to be controlled, right? So that they can perform physical therapy, so that they can rest, and so that to allow healing to occur. But when you use those opiates for too long, then those patients become addicted. And so sometimes you do see deaths related to that. That's why there is such a movement to really, really tighten down on how physicians are ordering those opiates, how long the patient will be on those drugs. Really, they should not be on those drugs for a very long time at all. They should switch over within, even if possible, just a few weeks to more like ibuprofen and Tylenol instead of the opiates. Yes.
Back home, I worked in pain and rehab, and there was like huge problem in a like small community north of Green Bay. But they were saying that a lot of people, not only like is opioid abuse becoming more prominent, but people are turning to use the use of heroin because it's cheaper than buying like prescription pills from somebody.
Okay. Wow.
And the UDS guy that would come in drug screening, he told us that heroin, when used, can only be detected in the urine drug screen up to 24 hours after.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
She was saying that in some a little town or area north of Green Bay, you said that they're seeing heroin being used more, partly because it's cheaper and sometimes easier to get than getting opiates. And then it's actually not detected in the urine drug screen
He said, yeah.
past 24 hours.
It can be
Not detected in the
I
urine drug
like
screen after
looked to
24
see, but
hours.
I would assume that if you worked for that company.
And this is a guy who worked for a urine drug screen company. That's very interesting.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, anyway, so just be aware that, of course, suicide is very, the suicidal ideation, those thoughts can definitely be related to underlying psychiatric disorders. As we know, a lot of those psychiatric disorders are often underdiagnosed. So we need to be able to recognize all of this as we're assessing patients in general. There it goes on to talk about biological factors. I'll let you read through that. And second, the Freud's theory, I'll let you read through that. I will just mention environmental factors. That's on page 477. It says recent theories of suicide focus on the diathesis stress model, the lethal combination of suicidal fantasies accompanied by loss. That loss could be love, self-esteem, job, and freedom due to imminent incarceration. It could be due to rage or guilt, identification with an individual who completed the suicide. So that is called a copycat suicide. Just kind of understand what a copycat suicide is. It follows a highly publicized suicide of a public figure, could be an idol or a peer in the community. Adolescents are especially at high risk due to the immature prefrontal cortex, the portion of the brain that controls the executive functions involving judgment, frustration tolerance, and impulse control. And I think I've read studies where females, their prefrontal cortex matures at a faster rate compared to males. So just, I thought that was an interesting note. I remember reading that in other things, because I always think about when I look at my 4 kids, that my daughters just seem more mature than my sons. And I always said my sons, I felt like were like 2 years behind. I'm not putting my sons down, okay, because they're great guys. But I think you do see that to a degree. Just guys just always appear, and I'm not getting onto my guys here, okay, so, but just sometimes a little bit more immature, especially in the adolescent stage, you know. And that's because of that maturation of the prefrontal cortex. And it does, again, adolescents are especially at high risk due to their immature prefrontal cortex, and especially guys, I would think it would be at a little bit of a higher risk for a little bit longer of a period, because there is that maturation for the male, for the prefrontal cortex is a little bit longer. So also read through cultural factors. There were some very interesting notes I underlined. Looking at on the second column in 477, it says among African Americans, men complete suicide more often than women. The peak rate occurs in young adulthood and middle age. Protective factors for this group as a whole include the religion and the role of the extended family, both of which provide a strong social support system. So there's that maybe slight advantage for African Americans because of the importance in general within their culture of religion and the importance of the role of extended family. They do have that good, sometimes that's not true, but sometimes it is a good support system, especially through the extended family. And it goes on to the next column, well, also mentioning similar, this is true among Hispanic Americans, because the Roman Catholic religion is very important. Overall, not necessarily to all, it's not saying that all Hispanics are Roman Catholic, but many are. And as you know, with the Roman Catholic religion, suicide is considered a very grave sin. Some people who within that religion believe that it's an unforgivable sin, so that one should not commit suicide for that reason, because you can't ask for forgiveness once you've committed the sin. So, and then it mentions just down below, among Asian Americans, suicide rates increase with age. Beliefs that reduce suicide attempts include the adherence to religions and the emphasis that emphasize interdependence between the individual and society. Among Asian cultures, there is, remember, first of all, we mentioned in the past that there is a very much of a respect among most individuals towards those people who are older, the elders. And then there's also a very high respect to the society in general. Okay. So anyway, going on, I'm going to go ahead and go on to the next page. It talks about other risk factors on page 478. You can kind of read through that. Let's see here. Let's see here. I have this video. Let's watch this real quick.
Every year, 1 million people take their own life, and suicide is thought to be vastly underreported. Who are these people, and why do they do it? Hey friends, I'm Lacey Green, and you're watching D News. We've got some dark, very dark stuff for you today. You have been warned. Over the past 45 years, the global suicide rate has risen by 60%. In the United States, it's more common than car accident deaths, making it a worrisome public health issue. So what's going on? Why are people killing themselves? It's a loaded question, obviously, But researchers at the University of British Columbia are trying to put the pieces together. They just published the largest study ever done on the motivations for suicide. What they found was that many of the assumed motivations for suicide aren't reality. Things like impulsive personality types, attention seekers, or financial problems weren't the cause. For 100% of the participants, they found that suicide was a way to solve a problem, the problem of ongoing and overwhelming emotional pain, the problem of hopelessness so profound that it consumes you completely. It's a dark place that some of us might visit briefly, but then move on from and recover. Suicide happens when a person can't escape their misery. Understanding suicide as a problem-solving behavior is an uncomfortable thing to sit with, but the hope is that ongoing research will eventually help us understand how to help people who are at risk for suicide and to help people who have made a suicide attempt to recover. The question still lingers though. If we know that emotional pain is at the heart of suicide, what causes that emotional pain in the first place? The short answer is, well, we don't really know that yet at all. I mean, it really depends. To demystify, another study released this month by Stanford and Lund University examined suicide trends across 7 million Swedes, and they found that depression was the highest risk factor for suicide. Clinical depression makes someone 32 times more likely to commit suicide, and lots of other mental illnesses are high risk too, like schizophrenia and borderline personality disorder. Some risks are social though, they come from the person's environment. For instance, having a poor social support system, someone who just moved to a new city, who's divorced, who has trouble making friends, who doesn't have a supportive family, or even their gender. Men are 3 times more likely to kill themselves than women. For men, being young and uneducated are risk factors, but the biggest one is being single. For women, the biggest risk factor was being unemployed. Ongoing bullying, harassment, serious relationship problems, chronic illness, and having attempted suicide before all raise the risk as well. So if you're worried about someone in your life who's threatened to commit suicide, or if you're feeling suicidal yourself, please do take it seriously. We may not fully understand this yet, but that doesn't mean that we can't support each other through it. So reach out as soon as possible and let someone understand the pain you're in, or you could get help helping someone else. I'll link to some places that I think are particularly helpful down below, including a hotline that I think is really awesome that I used to work on. Thanks for joining me for D-News, guys. Feel free to share your thoughts and stories down.
Okay, I just thought that was a kind of a good video to sort of sum up where we kind of have been going the last little while. So let me find my place again. We already talked about that. We'll go just a little bit more on LGBT youth and bullying. Can y'all see the screen? Oh, yeah, y'all should be able to still. Let me go back to my slides. Y'all can see that. So online bullying, that's probably a new thing, right? Over the last, I'd say, couple of years, of course, with the advent of social media, started out with MySpace, right? Y'all remember MySpace a little bit? I didn't know much about it. My kids kind of, did that. And then I was sort of getting into it. And then somehow they switched over to Facebook. But now they say that Facebook really is for old people. And teenagers don't even use Facebook really anymore. They use Snapchat and what else? I don't know. What? Instagram, that's the one, yeah. Snapchat's the one where they disappear right after you view it. I get so upset. Every once in a while, actually, I don't even know how to use my Snapchat, so it doesn't upset me too much. But it's like this cute picture of my kid, and then it just goes away, and then I can't see it again. It's kind of frustrating. So, but yeah, I use Facebook now, and of course, some of my kids kind of do. Josh doesn't. My youngest, he doesn't. So I just never hear from him unless he texts me. But anyway, so because of all this social media now, online bullying is really, really getting to be prevalent. Name calling, just whether it's online or through social media, in person, in the hallway as the students are walking to class, verbal harassment, physical harassment. I mean, going back to my junior high years, I did not have the best junior high years, and I remember this one girl who really bullied me in the gym class, and I mean, it was devastating. Really, Michelle. I hope your name's not Michelle, because when my first I'm thinking it's like, ugh. But she was a mean girl, very mean. But anyway, at that age, junior high, high school, it's so impactful because that's when you're starting to, your friends are so important to you. Your friends become really more important to you than your family. And then when you have certain people who, they're not your friends, obviously, but of that same age group, bullying you, saying mean, nasty things about you, it can be so impactful. I watched a couple of videos. I don't think I'm going to take time to share them, but it was a 14-year-old male, cute kid. It's a video about him. And for somehow somebody took a picture of him, not a picture, a video of him while he was in the restroom. And then that video got out to all of the entire school. And the school really didn't do anything about it, teachers, administration, etc. 2 weeks later, he committed suicide. He said he couldn't take it anymore. So I think that happened several years ago, a similar situation here at our high school. A situation that was somehow observed by some other students. Those other students started talking about it. It just went everywhere crazy. My kids were in school at the time. And the guy who was involved committed suicide a few days later. So anyway, there's some more facts there. It's just physical harassment. White LGB and Hispanic bisexual females more likely to be bullied than white heterosexuals. Black LGB's vulnerability to bullying was about the same as white heterosexual youths. Sexual minority youths were more likely to report suicidal ideation. And you can have your opinion on the LGBT lifestyle, but we do need to recognize, no matter what our opinion is as healthcare providers, that we still have the obligation to provide all people safe environments. Okay, so just remember that. We talked about the protective factors and within the different cultures. Okay, we talked about, we'll briefly talk about this, societal factors. Assisted suicide in certain states, individual states can allow, regulate, or prohibit assisted suicide. There are some countries, Netherlands, Belgium, Switzerland, where assisted suicide is legal. So we're kind of going off of the topic of just what we're thinking about, suicidal ideation, acts of suicide. Here we're talking about those special circumstances where a person really wants to end their life, and it's usually related to some type of physical illness, maybe some type of cancer that's going to be very painful, some other kind of long-term disease that is going to end up in their causing death, and the patient doesn't want to experience maybe the pain, the hardships of going through that illness, and they feel like that they have a right to make a choice when they do end their life because of that underlying long-term disease. So I know, what are the states, do y'all remember that there are 2 states, I think, that kind of do allow assisted suicide in our country?
Oregon and Washington.
I'm sorry?
Is it Oregon and Washington?
Oregon and Washington? I was thinking
Mentions, Montana.
in Montana. I was thinking the first one I was thinking about was either Oregon or Washington State, what that I knew about for a long time. So, of course, right now we do not do that, of course, within the state of Oklahoma, but you definitely might want to be aware of, especially if you ever ended up moving to Washington State or Oregon or a state where they do allow for assisted suicide. You would probably, as a nurse especially, want to kind of know more details about that, about the state laws within that state toward that. And then suicide bombing. Again, this is really probably a completely different animal altogether, I guess you could say. The reasons for suicidal bombing have nothing to do with the reasons that on an everyday basis we have people in our country who do commit suicide. And so we're not going to really include those in that discussion, okay? So going on, just what are we going to be looking at now? Identifying evidence-based practice suicide risk assessment tools, describing 3 expected reactions a nurse may have experience when working with patients who have suicidal ideation, discuss basic level interventions in the hospital or the community, and explain key elements of suicidal precautions and environmental safety factors within the hospital. So this is going to be really, really pertaining to you all as nurses, even as we're just nursing students going into the hospital settings. We really need to be aware of these, okay? So we've already kind of talked about that. There was, I did underline this. It go on page 478 and under the clinical picture, a history of suicide attempts puts a person at a higher probability of actually completing suicide in the future, particularly in the first 12 months following the attempt. So that does need to be a question that we're asking our patients. Have they attempted suicide in the past? If so, has it been within the last 12 months? If that is the case, then we need to understand that they are at a higher risk for committing suicide still, and we need to have them with the correct nursing diagnosis and with the correct risk that we're taking care to prevent that. Okay. Here is, I'm going to go ahead and do this. This is just a link. This is, I think the book mentions it. It's called the safety tool. This tool was based on research outcomes from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. Okay, it is not taking me there. Okay, maybe. Okay. Let's see here. Well, can y'all see that? Y'all can't see that, can you? Let me see. Wait, just 1 second. I'm just trying to open it.
If you do control plus side, it should be, there's a plus sign down at the bottom right of your screen.
Oh, yeah. Okay. There. Can y'all see that? I'm more just on the right-hand side where you have your safety. This is a suicide assessment, 5-step evaluation and triage. So for mental health professionals. So when you're assessing your person, you need to identify the risk. Note those that can be modified to reduce risk. Okay. So it's the first thing we need to do, identify any risk factors. Identify protective barriers. Note those that can be enhanced. Conduct a suicidal inquiry. Ask them about suicidal thoughts. Ask them about any plans. Assess for any behavior and intent to carry out that plan. Then determine their risk. Choose the appropriate intervention to address and reduce the risk. And of course, document. Document that you've done this. Document your findings. Document your, of course, your interventions and follow-up. So I know it sounds kind of like just generic words there, but if you make sure that you are looking at each of those areas as you're assessing your patient. Okay. So let me go back to it. So let's first of all assessing our patient. Let's look in your book. On page 479, first of all, let's look about what they're saying to us. What are those verbal and nonverbal cues? Okay. What kind, and not all people will have necessarily verbal cues, those who are thinking about suicide. Many will have some, will demonstrate some of these cues. So what are some examples? Overt statements like, I can't take it anymore. Or life isn't worth living. I wish I were dead. Everyone would be better off if I died. Those are pretty overt, definitely, very obvious statements, I guess you could say, that they really are possibly thinking about committing suicide. Some thoughts of suicidal ideation. Now, more statements that maybe aren't quite as obvious, are a little bit more hidden, and yet the meaning is still there, are these covert statements and nonverbal cues. It is okay now, soon, everything will be fine. What is that supposed to mean? You're thinking, what are they going to do to make sure everything's fine? Things will never work out. I won't be a problem much longer. Nothing feels good to me anymore and probably never will. How can I give my body to medical science? Okay, so there's just some covert statements that maybe somebody would make that would definitely make you question, are they possibly contemplating suicide? Most often it is a relief for people contemplating suicide to finally to talk to someone about their despair and loneliness. You may think, oh, they're not going to, if I ask them if they're going to commit suicide, there's no way they're going to say yes because they don't want me to know, right? But, and then that's kind of, maybe that's what I would think. I would think if they're really wanting to commit suicide, they're not going to be telling me as a nurse. That's actually not true in most cases. They really are wanting that chance to talk about their feelings of despair and loneliness. So we need to be asking those direct questions about suicide, especially when we see those overt statements and covert statements and maybe some nonverbal cues, okay? What are we going to ask them? Have you ever felt that life is not worth living? Have you been thinking about death recently? Do you ever think about suicide? Have you ever attempted suicide? Do you have a plan for completing suicide? These are questions that really, especially the first few, that we should be asking every patient that we have in the hospital setting, especially if we're working in the hospital setting. Really, it doesn't matter where we're doing, not on a daily basis, but upon that admission assessment, we really should be asking those questions. And I think that really these questions are now built into our assessments, okay? And we don't need to be skipping over those or kind of just blowing them off lightly. I know a lot of times when, and I've done it myself, we're very busy. We have 2 admissions that day. We got to go in, we got to hurry up, we're on the computer screen. We've kind of done a physical assessment real quick, and now we're just standing there staring at the screen, typing, kind of asking questions as we go. And we're not giving time, especially when we get to questions like this. You need to be really sitting down, maybe even with the patient at their eye level, saying, you know, have you ever felt that life wasn't worth living? They're going to maybe answer that question a little bit better if you're sitting there really looking at them, waiting for them to respond, instead of standing there looking at your computer screen, typing in your answers as quickly as you can. And I know that time management in the hospital setting is a very difficult thing to achieve. I have never really achieved it myself. So good luck to y'all. I like it. I like working in ICU because you only have your one patient. Maybe they're like actively dying in front of you, but I can take care of that. Taking care of 6 patients, oh, that just puts me in a state of, but anyway. But I'm just saying that when you do ask these questions, they need to be asked. Make sure that you're giving the correct body language yourself to the patient so that they will respond. If they really are starting to, sound like they are having maybe thoughts of suicide, you need to really go in deeper and asking them if they have that plan. And if so, what is that plan? And then you need to ask, and this isn't in your book, but it's very important to know. And do you have access to what you need to carry it out? Okay, go ahead and find out, do they have a gun at home? Or do they have a gun in their car? Or do they have a lot of maybe codeine pills or Percolone or some kind of, opiate type drug that they've been kind of saving for maybe they had knee surgery 6 months ago. And I know a lot of times when my sons have had different knee surgeries or shoulder surgeries. And I was really surprised at the amount of drugs that the doctor prescribed for my son, after they had the surgery, because they didn't really need that many pills. So now we have all these extra pills at home. And if you don't really take care of getting rid of those pills, then maybe, could maybe your son or daughter have access to those later on? So you always ask that question, do you have access to what you need to carry out your plan? Okay. So it is very important to recognize verbal and nonverbal cues. And it's very important to ask the specific questions. Okay. Going on to the next column, I have this underlined. The nurse should be alert for nonverbal clues, including showing a sudden brightening mood with more energy. So a lot of times, now this will be after they have decided, you know what, I am going to go ahead and end my life. I can't take this pain, this hopelessness any longer. I'm going to do it. And it seems like with some people, when they decide, they truly make that decision to do it, their mood actually brightens, okay? They have more energy, especially after recently being prescribed an antidepressant. Giving away their possessions. Maybe they say, you know what, they go to a friend, this has just been my favorite sweater, I wear it every day, I want you to have it. That's not a good thing, okay? That's a clue that they're really thinking about carrying out the suicide plan. Writing letters, organizing their financial affairs. Individuals may be at a greater risk as their mood lifts because they have enough energy to act on their feelings of ambivalence regarding suicide. The risk of suicide is highest in the first year after a suicide attempt. So again, we think we're treating the depression, we're getting them on their antidepressants, but if we haven't really fixed those feelings of hopelessness, then actually the raising of the mood from being on the antidepressants now gives them enough energy to then carry out the suicide plan. Now, does that mean that we don't treat the depression? No, we need to treat the depression. We just need to be aware of, just because our patient seems to be a little bit more chipper now, that they're on their antidepressants for 2 days, doesn't mean, oh, we fixed them. It could mean that now they're going to really carry it out. Okay, so, and it goes one more, on the next paragraph it says, asking about suicidal ideation is the single most important assessment and intervention. Why might we hesitate? Possible reasons for hesitancy in the screening include lack of personal comfort, lack of professional confidence, and time constraints. I kind of already addressed that. And I can honestly say that several years ago, I was very, very uneasy asking questions about suicide to our patients. They came in for, because their gallbladder is sick and they need their gallbladder out. And here we are asking them about suicide. But remember, if we go back to when we said that's what high percentage of patients did seek medical attention for something else, maybe within the year before they committed suicide. So we really need to be asking these questions, and we really need to be making sure that we are confidently asking them, not like I don't really want you to answer this, so just say no so that I can go on to my next one. We can have that attitude if we're not careful. So make sure that we're giving the time, have the body language, the way we say the question, that we are opening the door for them to talk about it if they want to.
What about children, adolescents,
I would definitely think with adolescents, yes. Now, I don't know about school-age children. I don't know really, I'm not sure about that. I would be interested to even just go to the hospital. It's been forever since I've done a pediatric admission assessment, but are those questions on there? I don't know. I would definitely think for adolescents, yes, you would definitely ask that. I definitely think so, yes. Okay. And then going on to the lethality of the suicide plan, we've already kind of mentioned this. They kind of divide it into hard methods versus soft methods. Let's see here. I think I've skipped over. I'm not caught up on my PowerPoint. Well, I'll go over this and I'll show a video real quick and then we'll take a break. But based on lethality of method, which indicates how quickly a person would die by that mode, you can classify the method as higher or lower risk. So your higher risk methods are also referred to as hard methods, and those include using a gun, jumping off of a high place, hanging, poisoning with carbon monoxide, staging a car crash. I watched a short video. There's so many good videos. I just can't show you all of them. But about some people will, while they're driving down the highway, will all of a sudden just cut into the front of a semi truck, and that's the way they end their lives. And it just talked about the one thing I was watching briefly was about the trucker who that happened to. It was very obviously that was probably a suicidal, that the person wanted to commit suicide and use the truck and the driver, cutting in front of the truck, and the truck ran over basically the car, killed the person. How the impact on that driver of the truck, that's just something to kind of think about, kind of a different subject, but anyway, that is another way that some people think about and do commit suicide. Your lower risk methods are also referred to as soft methods, include cutting one's wrist, inhaling natural gas, and ingesting pills. So anyway, let me see. What was this video that I wanted y'all to watch? I think I'm not.
Screening for suicidal ideation does not require a lot of time, but it does require some sensitivity. In the following video, you can see that the physician asks all the right questions, but does so in such a way that he does not detect what is going on. Well, looks like your health has been pretty good. I see you're a volleyball player. Any problem with pain in your muscles or joints?
No, swimming is good for that.
Yeah. And your allergies, how are they?
I get only has no on them, but nothing really helps.
You look like something's bothering you. How are you doing emotionally? Do you need depression?
Well, no.
Any suicide thoughts? Anything like that?
No.
Are you using any drugs?
Of course not.
Okay, well, I just want to make sure. Oh, wait, hold on. In this second scene, the physician is much more sensitive, but he makes another common error, that is, moving too quickly to reassure the patient. Marcy, let me ask you some questions about your feelings. How are you feeling most of the time?
Okay, I guess.
Well, you look a little down. Are you feeling sad about anything?
Sometimes it's no big deal. There's just a lot of drama in school.
Can you tell me about it?
Well, it's sort of silly. I was doing really well in volleyball, and then I just hit a slump. A couple games, I missed easy shots. It cost us a game, and we might not go to regionals. I overheard a couple of other girls talking, and I think they said I blew the team's chances of going to state.
Well, volleyball is a team sport. No one person is responsible for a loss. You shouldn't beat yourself up about it.
I know. That's what my mom says.
Well, volleyball season will be over soon. Everyone will forget about it. And next year you can make a fresh start.
You're right. I need to focus on grades.
I agree that's important for college these days. In this final scene, the physician asks more open-ended questions, and thus the patient feels more comfortable talking about difficult issues. Marcy, let me ask you some questions about your feelings. How are you feeling most days?
Okay, I guess.
Well, you look a little down. Are you feeling depressed about anything?
It's no big deal. There's just a lot of drama at school.
Can you tell me about it?
Well, I was doing really well in volleyball, and then I just hit a slump. A couple of games, I missed easy shots. It cost us a game, and we might not go to regionals. I overheard a couple of other girls talking, and I think they said I blew the team's chances of going to state.
Do you feel responsible for the team not going on?
Yes, I feel like I've wasted everyone's time and let everyone down. I played club volleyball all summer. We traveled to tournaments, and my parents spent a fortune.
It sounds really disappointing. How often are you feeling that way? Is it once a day or once a week?
A lot, probably at least a few times a week.
And when the sad feeling lasts, how long does it usually go on?
A couple of hours, sometimes even a whole day.
Do you get down on yourself or call yourself names?
Yes, I feel like I've wasted everyone's time. I hate myself.
And how bad does that feeling get? Do you ever think about hurting yourself or dying?
No. Well, are you going to tell my parents?
Well, I think if you're feeling that bad, they probably want to know. I think they'd want to help.
I would never kill myself, but sometimes I think maybe it wouldn't be so bad if I got killed in a car accident or something. Then I wouldn't have to worry about all this.
And are you feeling like hurting yourself at all now?
Oh,
Well, I'm really glad you shared this with me. What I'd like to do is have your mom come in and we'll tell her together about how you've been feeling. I know things seem really bad right now, but sometimes talking to therapists can help.
my mom's going to think I'm crazy.
Well, you're not crazy, and I'll help explain it to her.
So really, it seems like kind of logical things to do, but I think, again, you could even see that in that middle one, in that middle example, he was asking the kind of correct questions. He just was then kind of rationalizing, and then she wasn't able to really express her true feelings. So anyway, let's go ahead and take a break. It is, what was it, 10:11? We'll come back in 10 minutes from now. So it is 10:11, yeah. So 10:21.
I'm just gonna step outside and try to get some fresh air. I can't breathe in here, so I'm gonna call the doctor and see if I can get a shot. I've been sick all weekend.
Is it worse in here?
Yeah, I'm stuffy.
But it's not like there's something about your allergies.
Mm-mm. No, it's been like this since Friday. So,
Okay. Okay, we are back. Sorry, I ran a little bit late. So we're continuing on. Let me switch over back to computer. And let's go back to our PowerPoint. Why is that not working? Okay. Make sure that, and we've kind of already mentioned that, but that you are doing the self-assessment. You know, do you have anything related to something that will cause you to be not as good in communicating with your patient, asking them about thoughts of suicide, etc. So I'll let you read through that on your own, just because we do need to kind of get on. But again, just remembering, I want to reiterate the importance of you understanding the overt statements and the covert statements and nonverbal clues that a person may have, those who are having maybe suicidal ideations, making sure that you understand what questions you need to ask. And the one that's really not included in your book, but I think that's important as well, is do you have any access to what you need to carry out your suicidal ideations? Make sure we understand the nonverbal behavioral clues. It could be the hopelessness, signs of hopelessness, but it could also be that sudden brightening mood, the giving way of possessions, writing letters, etc. Make sure that you read that on page 479 there. Understand that, okay? Let's going on to talking about intervention. As far as, first of all, I could go back, we're looking at the nursing process and what are some possible nursing diagnoses that we might end up having for our patient. That could be risk for suicide, self-care deficit, sleep pattern disturbance, altered nutrition, anxiety. Okay. We want them to, our main goal, overall goal, is to be, for the person to restrain themselves from committing the act. That was our main goal. Then, of course, you will have goals that support that main goal. And then we'll have planning. So when we're thinking about interventions for suicide, the book mentions kind of primary intervention. I don't think I saw it in the book, but I mentioned also here secondary and tertiary kind of interventions for suicidal precautions, preventions. So when we think about primary, secondary, tertiary interventions for suicide. So I have an example here. So you're going to tell me, is it primary, secondary, or tertiary? So you have a patient is seen in the emergency room after a purposeful overdose. Measures are taken to remove all sharp objects and any loose cords from the room. A nurse is assigned to the patient for one-to-one observation. So what is this? Primary, secondary? Secondary. Because it's acute. It's an acute setting. We'll look at all of them first, and we'll talk about them. Let's go to the next one. So here, now this is, what is this? You have a local college nursing club visits with junior high students about the importance of not bullying and self-esteem. That is primary, right? These students, hopefully, for the most part, have not considered suicide yet. And we are giving them tools in our discussions about making sure that we don't bully, that we, if somebody's bullying us, we know what to do. And just the overall, general importance of self-esteem. If there's a group that goes into a school to do this, this is preventing those thoughts from hopefully ever occurring. We are preventing suicide. So that's primary. And here is the next one. We have a person who did attempt suicide 2 years ago. The person continues to attend monthly support groups for those who have attempted suicide in the past. That's tertiary. Okay. So, and we'll talk about more about primary, secondary, and tertiary as we talk about all the disease processes that we go through, even when we get on into med-surg. But for right now, understand, so primary is when we're just trying to prevent it in general, talking to maybe school-age children, junior high, high school students about, again, like we said, importance of self-esteem, etc. The secondary prevention is that, and it's seen in that acute stage when maybe the person did just come into the hospital after somehow attempting to take their life. And we're doing those important first measures to make sure that they are safe, providing safety for them while they're in the hospital setting. Tertiary is after, they are safe now. They're no longer maybe having those thoughts, but just continuing those support groups so that hopefully they won't ever have those thoughts again. Okay. So the levels of intervention, prevention, treatment, and postvention. That is for postvention is a term used for the interventions with a circle of survivors left by individuals who completed suicide to reduce the traumatic after effects. So just remember that, especially with our patients who are attempting suicide, maybe a near suicide, or who have committed suicide, those family members especially sort of become our patients, okay? And we have to be very therapeutic in what we're saying to them, making sure that they have good phone numbers, maybe social service consults, so that they can have contact numbers, places, people to talk to outside of the hospital who will support them after these tragedies have occurred. Okay. Let's see here. There's different interventions. I do want to mention make sure that you are reviewing page 481. That's just a real good overview. It's like a case study and a care plan. So make sure you read through that. For time's sake, we're going to go ahead and go on. I do have psychosocial interventions on page 482. One important, and this is in the kind of on the left column there when it talks about a safety plan. One particular aspect of counseling is the use of a patient safety plan. And this is not used just in those patients who attempt suicide. This may be seen in somebody who maybe a person comes into the emergency room. I think Mrs. Johnson will talk more about this next lecture. But maybe you have somebody who's being abused by, maybe a woman being abused by her husband, but she still wants to go home. But we know that the abuse is taking, there is abuse going on. Now, if it's a child, we intervene differently. We report that abuse immediately. Unless an adult wants us to, we really can't report abuse, especially if they don't want us to. But sometimes before they leave that emergency room, we talk with them and we help them establish a safety plan so that they have steps to take in case the abuse does, or the person who's doing the abuse is being violent again toward them, a way that they can get out. Okay, maybe people that they can contact, maybe phone numbers available to them. So that's so safety plans are not just for people who have attempted suicide, but in this case, that's what we're focusing on. So your book says it's a written 6-step plan that includes identification of warning signs, internal coping strategies, social settings, and people who provide distraction. It also provides instructions on people who patients can ask for help, professionals or agencies where they can find help during a crisis, and how to make the environment safe. And the last question, and you can see that there's an example of that on page 483 in your book. It goes through those exact steps or questions that we just mentioned. The very last one is they need to write down the one thing that is most important to me and worth living for is. Because remember, a lot of times your people who are attempting suicide, they feel hopeless. The video kind of mentioned the hopelessness is so profound for these patients. So if they can kind of hang on to, remember that one thing that is most important to them, why they want to live, then that might help in preventing that next suicide attempt. So make sure you understand that how to do the safety plan. Read through your pharmacological interventions. It mentions there on the second column on 482, long-term lithium treatment for bipolar disorder and major depression significantly reduces suicide and suicide attempts. Of course, there is side effects with that drug. There's the necessary periodic blood work. So that might make the patient a little less compliant with that. but we want to give education to promote adherence. And then it talks about for patients experiencing psychotic or bipolar manic episodes, the antipsychotics that can be used. Make sure you understand that. And then it mentions finally, anti-anxiety medication may help treat risk factors such as severe anxiety, panic, and agitation. Aggressive treatment of anxiety beyond antidepressants is advisable based on current research. Okay. So make sure you read through those. And then it talks about somatic intervention, about electroconvulsive therapy. That's on page there 482 as well. Evidence suggests that ECT decreases acute suicidal ideation. So again, make sure you read that. And this sounds kind of hard to believe, but ECT therapy, it is safe and effective for pregnant patients. So a lot of times pregnant people cannot take a lot of the drugs because of the possible risks to the fetus. But it doesn't seem like it makes sense, but ECT is actually safe in pregnant women. So somebody who is suffering from maybe major depression during a pregnancy and they can't take the medications, ECT therapy might be, or ECT might be a solution or an intervention that the doctors choose to do. So make sure you read about that. Okay. Again, the Malou therapy, we need to really promote this safe environment for the person. And I'm looking at the very bottom of page 483. Now, again, back to what are we going to be experiencing in the hospital setting? We may be taking care of those patients who come into ER after an attempted suicide, and we're having to care for them maybe in the hospital setting for a while before they can be transferred to another facility. It says, so we need to be aware of what our policies are for hospital safety, suicidal precautions wherever we work. Okay, a lot of times that's definitely going to be meaning one-on-one observation. Okay, you need to be observing them at all times, whoever that person is assigned to do that. We need to be taking out anything out of the room that could pose a possible physical threat to the person. So definitely any kind of needles, the sharps container, any kind of cords. You might be thinking telephone cords. You could be thinking of cords related to maybe the window shades. Okay, you got to just consider the actual physical safety of the room. And again, making sure that you're reading your policies. There's a good box there, I think, on page 484 on 25.4 are your environmental guidelines. Make sure you read through those. Also, the table 25.3, suicide precautions with constant one-to-one observation. So anyway, so that's good to read over as well. And of course, again, documenting is very important. I'll let you read through that because we need to kind of get on, but make sure that you are documenting appropriately. It talks a little bit about your survivors of suicide, so make sure you're reading through that. If you're going on to page 485, I do have this underlined. Adolescents who suffer traumatic grief after a friend's death by suicide are more likely to report suicidal ideation within 6 years of the suicide. So for all these teenagers out there, because you know every year we do hear in our community about maybe 1 or 2 individuals throughout the year who have completed suicide. So what about all of those friends associated with that person, especially close friends? Statistically, they have a higher risk of suicidal ideation up to 6 years after that event has occurred. Okay. Family members of individuals who complete suicide develop a 4.5 times greater risk of suicide than those families in which no suicide has occurred. So it definitely has an impact on family members. It says, based on statistics, there are 6 survivors per suicide completion, and there are more than 6 million Americans who are considered survivors in the U.S. during the past 25 years. Okay. So in the next, it goes on page 485 on that second column. It's still talking about the survivors of suicide. It says if being a survivor is the main reason an individual seeks treatment, remember that the survivor, not the deceased, is the patient. Focus on the patient's thoughts and feelings and do a thorough assessment as you usually would. If you are a friend or a relative of a suicide survivor, remember that the most difficult time for these survivors is not the immediate aftermath. It's really the next weeks, months, and years following the loss. So it's not the very first few days afterwards. There's just such a shock. It's the weeks, months, and years that follow. Okay, so I'll let you read through that. Briefly, just I'll mention, we're kind of skipping on because of time. I do want to just address quickly non-suicidal self-injury. This is on page 486. A closely related problem to suicidal behavior is non-suicidal self-injury. These self-injuries are deliberate and direct attempts to inflict shallow yet painful injuries to the surface of the body without intending to end one's life. These behaviors most commonly consist of cutting, burning, scraping or scratching the skin, biting, hitting, skin picking, and interfering with wound healing. Often the self-injuries report multiple methods of injury. And believe it or not, most of these people, the majority of self-injurers, do not seek professional help. Okay? Self-injuries actions are most often done with the intent to either alleviate psychic pain or to pierce the psychic numbing these individuals describe. Okay, so it's almost like it's either one or the other. They're actually numbing the pain, or because they're so numb themselves, they want to have that pain to kind of almost make them feel like they're real, alive. Other times, these actions are used to punish themselves, to connect with others, to get attention, to escape responsibility, or to avoid a situation. Okay, so make sure you read about all of that. Okay. It's a very bad subject, but we're going to go ahead and go on now. We're going to go ahead and go over to chapter 26. That starts on page 490. And I'm going to go ahead and switch my PowerPoints out. 25, 26. Okay. So we are talking about crisis and disaster. Okay. What's going on right now in the United States that could possibly be a new kind of natural disaster? There's a hurricane coming. You know what? I don't even know the name. Did y'all know the name? What is it? Florence? Is it Florence? Hurricane Florence. Oh, oh my goodness. You know, our Mrs. Greenwood, y'all know where she moved to, right? North Carolina. So, yeah. Yes, I know. And she has a beach. She's I think 4 blocks from the beach. I'm not sure. I can't remember. Wilmington? Is that right? Wilmington, North Carolina? Does that sound right? Anyway, she's in North Carolina. She, being Miss Greenwood, I think she's excited. She's excited for it to come. So I'm not sure what's going on, but I do pray for her safety. So I'm afraid she's going to be standing on the beach challenging it. I don't know. So when we're talking about crisis, it can be, crisis can be many, many different things to different people. Okay. Natural disasters are just one example of maybe a crisis situation that somebody may experience. Okay. So going to 491, this chapter, we will discuss characteristics of crisis, theoretical models regarding crisis, types of crisis, phases of crisis, and then of course the nursing care for people experiencing severe events will be described. The nursing care is based upon the principle of crisis intervention. This is a directive, time-limited, and goal-directed strategy designed to assist individuals who are experiencing a crisis. Okay, so kind of keep that in mind. It is a directive, time-limited, it's goal-directed. It's designed to help or assist individuals who are experiencing a crisis. When we talk about that more here in a minute, there may be a couple of maybe questions that we ask our patients that are not going to sound like therapeutic communication. But for instance, we need to always assess their support people, Who do they have in their family or friends and their social network who can be supportive? And it may be almost like we're saying, oh, we're not going to help you with your problem. We're just going to, put you off on somebody else. And that's not what we're doing when we do that. We need to assess their support systems. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. So what are the characteristics of a crisis? And a crisis can be, a hurricane coming to the coast of where you live and you're thinking that, your house may be blown away. Definitely is a crisis, okay, that natural disaster. But many other things that seem small can still be a crisis to individuals, okay? So when we talk about crisis, we need to first just quickly understand, which we already do, but what is homeostasis? Homeostasis, when we think of it physiologically, we think of that balance of our body. I always think about our body wants to be at that, what's our pH equilibrium? 7.35 to 7.45, right? Y'all remember that for, normal blood gases, normal pH. That's equilibrium. We want to be at that nice, happy state. There's so many other things in our body that want to be at equilibrium. So what about just ourselves, our daily, day-to-day activities? We really do like to keep a normal kind of equilibrium, homeostasis. So what happens then when the crisis occurs? It disrupts our nice little homeostasis. A crisis, which is a major disturbance caused by a stressful event or threat, disrupts homeostasis. And this normal coping mechanism, in a crisis, normal coping mechanisms fail, and it results in an inability to function as usual. Equilibrium is replaced by disequilibrium. Make sure you understand that. When we have disequilibrium that is normally brought on by some type of crisis, and what might be a crisis to one person might not be a crisis to someone else. Lately, I've been kind of on Amazon Prime. If you have Amazon Prime, you can watch Monk for free, and I love Monk. Anyway, and it's just funny. Have y'all ever watched Monk? He's a homicide detective. He's very, very good, but he has very, very bad OCD and other types of maybe psychiatric disorders. And so one little thing that messes up his equilibrium and causes him to just go crazy, basically, would not even bother us, if he doesn't have the correct, the exact brand of, I can't remember what water he drinks, but a certain bottle of water that he drinks or certain wipes that he uses to wipe his hands. If he doesn't have those two little things, he goes into a state of crisis. Now, for us, that would not be a state of crisis. For him, it is. And that's just one example. There are a lot of other individuals who would also, the same thing might happen to them. What about a day? I'm thinking about teenagers, and maybe a boyfriend breaks up with a girlfriend. They've only been dating a week. And for many other people, maybe even other teenagers, that would be no big deal. They only were together a week, But for maybe that one person who was the one that, the girl who maybe the boyfriend broke up with her, it is a crisis for her. So just remember that all things that maybe are a crisis to one person wouldn't be a crisis to someone else, okay? And a lot of that depends upon then, of course, that perception of the event. How does a person perceive the event? It mentions here, people vary in the way they absorb, process, and use information from the environment. Some people may respond to a minor event as if it were life-threatening. Conversely, others may assess a life-threatening event and carefully consider options. For example, 10-year-old twins, Amy and Annie's parents are divorcing. Amy's grades plummet. She becomes despondent, has trouble sleeping. The twin, Annie, on the other hand, announces to her friends, "We get to move. I'll have a new bedroom that I can paint, and we'll be able to walk to school." So everybody perceives, different events differently. How you perceive it is what makes it a crisis. If it disrupts your equilibrium or homeostasis, causing disequilibrium. A lot of it depends upon what kind of support systems you have. Okay, so going on, it talks about different types of theories for crisis. I'll let you kind of read through that. I do want to move on. Let's see here. Where am I? For time's sake, I'm going to try to go on quickly. I do want to cover the types of crises. You do need to understand this. Okay, so on page 492, types of crises. You do need to understand the different types of crises. So what is a maturational crisis? This is a process of maturation occurs across the lifespan. We know that. Erik Erikson conceptualized the process as 8 stages of ego growth and development. And you can see that his work on chapter 2. But we won't focus on that now. Although you always need to know Erik Erikson's 8 stages of growth. Okay. Each stage represents a time when physical, cognitive, instinctual, and sexual changes prompt an internal conflict or crisis, which results in either psychosocial growth or regression. So that is why, for this category of crises, we consider these maturational crises. So when a person reaches a new stage, coping styles are no longer effective. New coping mechanisms have yet to be developed. Thus, for the time, the person is without effective defenses. This often leads to increased tension and anxiety, which may manifest as variations in the person's normal behavior. So examples of this could be leaving home for the first time. To me, I think of it, for me, I think it was my first maybe really bad crisis was going into junior high, right? And I think you see crisis for many people who go into junior high. Again, you're going through kind of a different growth. You're entering puberty. So you're having definitely maturational changes, both physically and emotionally. Maybe your coping mechanisms that you learned as a child aren't necessarily helping you now as you go into junior high. And so that's why you need good counselors in the junior high for sure. You need good teachers, good support systems. But anytime that you're having crises, that is just an example. That would be as an example of a maturational crisis. Maybe it's you're leaving home for the first time. You're having to balance a checkbook for the first time. You don't know how. And maybe you don't know how to spend your money wisely. And now you're broke, and that's putting you into a little bit of a crisis. Those are just examples of maturational crises. That can continue on. A lot of people retire. They work their whole lives very hard, have good lives, and then all of a sudden they retire, and now they don't know what to do with themselves. That is another example of a maturational crisis. And they have to kind of go through the days and weeks and learn how to adapt to that new change in their life. Some people adapt very well, very quickly. Others do not. Okay? So, but those are just examples of maturational crises. Okay? It talks about factors that can disrupt the progression through those stages. This is on page 493. Alcohol and drug addiction disrupts progression through these stages. Of course, this interruption often occurs among individuals during their adolescent years. So that's not good. But anyway, let's go ahead and go on and talk about situational crises. These arise from events that are extraordinary, external, often unanticipated, and yet we do see them on a routine basis. So what we're talking about here, a loss of or a change of a job, the death of a loved one, an abortion, changes in financial status, divorce, severe physical or mental illness. These are situational crises, okay? All of a sudden you come home and you find out that your spouse wants a divorce. That just rocks your world, basically, right? And you have to see what kind of support mechanisms you have, both coping mechanisms, outside, external support mechanisms to help you get through that. Some people have better coping mechanisms. Some people have strong outside support systems, and some do not. Okay? That's just one example of a situational crisis. Make sure that you understand the difference between a situational crisis and this next category, which is adventitious crisis. Now they say that both of them are not part of everyday life. To me, situational crisis, they are really a part of everyday life. We just don't experience them that often. We see them in different people. You know, at some point, all of us will experience the death of a loved one at some point. Hopefully not all of us will experience a divorce. Many of us will. And if we don't have a divorce, we'll have loved ones who experience that. We're going to probably y'all are going to be going through a maturational crisis in May. When you graduate, you pass that NCLEX, you start your new job, August comes around, and you can't come back to school. And some of y'all really say that I don't know if y'all will say that. You think right now, I will never say that, but some people actually say they miss coming to school. Do y'all believe that? You do? So, okay. Some of you were like, no, I will not miss this at all. But that's a situational crisis. You will be in a little bit of a situational crisis because you're going to be starting a new career as a nurse. Situational crisis probably of taking that NCLEX. That's going to be a little bit of a crisis until you. And then what about the hours, the 2 days it takes for you to get your results? Trust me, a lot of you will be in a little bit of a crisis there while you're waiting. But those are all situations. But the adventitious crisis, they result from natural disasters, acts of terrorism, war, riots, airplane crashes, floods, earthquakes. Also, what's considered an adventitious crisis is a crime of violence. Example, a rape, an assault, or a murder. It could be in the workplace, school, bombing in crowded areas, spousal or child abuse. So any type of violent crime like that is not situational. It is adventitious. Okay, so just remember that. And there's a whole extra level of problems with adventitious crises. It says that serious post-trauma responses include acute stress disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, major depressive disorders, especially related to those adventitious crises. So anyway, make sure you understand the different types of crises, okay? And then let's look at the phases of the crises. What are we actually going through? Okay, in phase 1, the book says a person confronted by a conflict or a problem that threatens his or her self-concept responds with increased feelings of anxiety. The increase in anxiety stimulates the use of problem-solving techniques and defense mechanisms in an effort to address the problem and lower anxiety. Okay, so you're initially, what are you seeing? Anxiety. And the person then is trying to, how am I going to deal with this anxiety? Okay. So we're going to start kind of activating our problem-solving skills. We're going to try, and hopefully that will help. And sometimes people can deal with the crises in phase 1. Those problem-solving techniques that they have are good. And so the crisis kind of ends there. Okay. But it can go on to the second phase. So this is seen when our coping skills, our problem-solving skills did not really help in phase 1. So now we're having rising levels of anxiety. Now those anxiety levels are producing discomfort. And now we're becoming kind of disorganized. Now we're still trying solutions to fix the problem, but they're kind of trial and error attempts now. Okay? But we're still trying to get back to equilibrium, trying to restore that balance. Sometimes that doesn't work. Now we're getting into phase 3 of a crisis. Now we're getting into panic levels. Okay? The person mobilizes automatic relief behaviors such as withdrawal and flight. The individual may make some form of resolution, such as compromising needs or redefining the situation to reach an acceptable solution in this stage. Okay, and the final phase is problem solving. Is phase 4. The problem is still not solved. We're still in this horrible state of disequilibrium. Our coping skills are not helping. Our trial and error skills did not help at all. We had this overwhelming anxiety. We're very disorganized. And now depression, confusion, violence against others, or suicidal behavior can occur. So we're trying to, hopefully this person will avoid phase 4. Hopefully they can get some outside help before that happens. Okay. So let's go. Let's look at our case study here. Let's go back to our case study real quick. Do we have a case study? Let's see. So we had this person. So we have a couple, Mr. and Mrs. Alessandro are devastated when a faulty ceiling fan causes an electrical fire in their home. Last Wednesday, they came home from dinner with friends to find that not only was their home destroyed, but that their cat Alfie is missing. He has not been seen since. Insurance is paying for their temporary stay in a tiny apartment for now, but Mr. Alessandro tells you that the place just adds to my wife's depression. I can't get her to do anything with me, not even take a walk, which she usually makes me do. We do go to the old neighborhood every day. We look for Alfie, but we're starting to lose hope for him. So they're in a crisis. And probably, now they're very concerned, of course, about the loss of their home. But what are they even more concerned about, it sounds like? The cat, Alfie. Now, you would think in some situations they should be thankful they had insurance. The insurance is paying for them a place to stay, probably is going to be covering hopefully a lot of their bills, so that they should be okay, right? But they're not. They're in a state of crisis, and they're very concerned about their missing cat. And cats, pets are very much a part of our family. So now let's go ahead and go on down back to where we were. So now we have Mr. Alessandro returns to the clinic 10 days later, bringing his wife with him. She seems though she is resentful. I don't want this, she says. Why can't people just leave me alone? Mr. Alessandro does most of the talking as his wife is clearly withdrawn. He talks about things he has done to try to cheer both of them up, but everything has failed. Ellie's withdrawing from everyone. She's so depressed. And me, I'm a basket case because I'm afraid we're never going to recover from this. Last week, I was driving to the grocery store, I guess, when I had to pull over because I couldn't breathe. I think it was my first panic attack, or first ever panic attack. So both of them are in this kind of phases of crises. They're handling it a little bit differently. They both are not handling it very well. He is to the point of having panic attacks. She is in this state of depression and withdrawing from everybody. So both are reacting to the crises in different ways. Okay? So where do you think they are right now? Yeah, I think the answer is kind of there, but it says, although identifying these phases is seldom completely cut and dry, students are correct in choosing either phase 2 or 3, though phase 3 is more likely. Trial and error has failed, and while Mrs. Alessandro uses withdrawal as a coping mechanism, her husband's anxiety has turned to panic. It is not phase 4 because no one is suicidal. Both are open to considering realistic solutions. The next question is, which term is most applicable to crisis? I'm not sure what that means. Is it self-limiting, boundaries, amnesia, or chronic? That's kind of a weird question, but it is self-limiting. Normally, a crisis is usually resolved in some way within 4 to 6 weeks. Usually, not necessarily. Okay. So, and then just as far as the nursing process, let's go ahead and turn to page 494. When we're assessing, we need to be assessing, number 1, the perception of precipitating events. How is the patient perceiving the precipitating event? Okay. Some of the questions we might ask, so I'm on page 494, now at the top of the second column. Because this person, for us to intervene, probably this person is somehow reaching out for help. So we're going to be asking them then, what leads you to seek help now? Has anything upsetting happened to you within the last few weeks or days or weeks? Describe how you're feeling. How does the situation affect your life? How do you see this event affecting your future? What do you hope to get out of this treatment? Oh, a good example of what we might be facing in a hospital setting. What would be a possible situation that we might be dealing with as a nurse in the hospital setting about a sudden crisis situation that might be for one of our patients? What do you think? So maybe somebody who comes in and they were maybe raped. Okay, what else? Maybe a very terminal type diagnosis. Maybe somebody has just been diagnosed with cancer. Okay, that is definitely a sudden crisis that person and their family members are having to deal with. Okay. So, and that definitely is something that probably as nurses, y'all were going to be seeing at some point or another, you know, having the doctor tell the patient that they've just been diagnosed with cancer. And then you're having to now go in. Now, of course, you would never share that diagnosis, right? You know that the doctor is going to be the one to share those medical diagnoses. And you got to be careful because every once in a while, maybe the person had some GI bleeding. And so a colonoscopy was done by the physician. And maybe they did determine from looking at maybe the some polyps that were found, the doctor really is suspecting cancer. But we have to make sure as nurses that we do not tell that new medical diagnosis to the patient. The doctor is the one who shares initially that new medical diagnosis. I think y'all know that, but I just wanted to kind of reiterate that. But definitely we might be the one who's going in after the patient's just been told about this new diagnosis. And so we can use our assessment skills from learning about this to maybe help us in intervening. We need to do this then. We need to assess the situational supports. This is very important. The next, the nurse needs to determine resources by assessing patient support systems. When available, family and friends can be involved by offering emotional or material support. If these resources are unavailable, the nurse acts as a temporary support person while assisting the patient to establish relationships with individuals or groups in the community. Sample questions might include, is there anyone, family or friends you would like to have involved in your care? Have you ever used a community agency for support? Do you have a religious affiliation? Are you active in a religious group? So you really do need to, so just because you're asking those questions does not mean that you're just saying, okay, I don't really want to help you. I'm just going to try to find your family or friends who can help you. That's not what you're saying. You're just trying to build up and assess what they do already have so that those support systems can help the person. The next one also is very important. What coping skills do they have right now that they might be able to use in this new crisis situation? Finally, the nurse assesses the patient's coping skills. Common positive coping mechanisms might be seeking out someone to talk to, writing feelings in a journal, engaging in other physical activity. Ineffective coping includes overeating, drinking, smoking, withdrawing, yelling, and fighting. Sample questions might include, what have you been doing to relieve the anxiety you have been feeling? Or in the past, what have you been doing to relieve anxiety or to deal with very devastating situations? What has helped you in the past to relieve stress? If they're in the middle of the crises, did you try it this time? If so, what is different? And what has helped you through difficult times in the past? We need to we need to be asking all of these questions if our patient's in a crisis, okay? So make sure you understand that. Let's see here. Make sure that we know different support systems out there for our patients. I'm skipping over stuff here. I do want to mention, so what are some different diagnoses, nursing diagnoses now? Let's talk about briefly the nursing care plan, the nursing process. A couple of good nursing diagnoses for these patients, depending upon what's going on. It could be ineffective coping, anxiety related to maturational, situational, or adventitious crises. Is always present in moderate, severe, and panic levels. And another one that's not mentioned in your book, but is also good, ineffective role performance. Whatever role that they have in life, this might be the role of them being a mother or a father. It could be their role in their workplace, in whatever job that they have. And maybe this crisis is causing them not to be a good mother or a good father or a good worker in that situation. So ineffective role performance is another good nursing diagnosis here. So ineffective coping, ineffective role performance, okay? So make sure you know those. Let's see here. I wanted to skip over, I'll let you read, just because of time, we need to go on. Make sure that you're reading about primary care, secondary care, and tertiary care. It's kind of the same as we had mentioned, talking about earlier, and about suicidal intervention as far as primary, secondary, and tertiary. What about us as healthcare workers, or any worker in a situation where you're dealing with maybe some kind of crisis? Would you consider just the simple act of maybe you're going to eat, maybe you're working on the floor? You normally do not deal with code blues that often, where the person, goes into a cardiac arrest and everybody's having to get together and we're doing CPR and following our ACLS guidelines and the patient doesn't make it. That is a crisis, okay? To a healthcare worker, it's maybe not a big crisis, but it is a crisis. So in any time that especially when you're dealing with a group of people going through a crisis, you should, at the end of that crisis, soon after everything's kind of settled down, you should do a debriefing. Have y'all heard that term, debriefing? We even do the debriefing right when we go through simulation. We, at the end, we sit down, we're out of the simulation, or you're out of the crisis situation, but you have a time to sit down, reflect back on what happened during that crisis situation. What were some of, maybe recognize some of the good things that occurred, some of the bad things that occurred. What are your feelings toward it? And you can, so it mentions on 495 there under self-assessment, debriefing is an important step for staff in coming to terms with overwhelmingly violent or otherwise disastrous situations. This is an intervention. Such an intervention helps staff put the crisis in perspective and begin their own recovery. And it is talked about later in the chapter. It's on just the next page on page 497. Under critical incident stress debriefing. If you look at the second column, it goes through the phases of this critical incident stress debriefing. You have your introductory phase where the meeting purpose is explained. And just an overview of the debriefing process is provided. You do ensure confidentiality in there. You explain the guidelines, maybe introduce team members if they don't know each other. And then the fact phase is participants discuss the actual facts of the incident. The thought phase is where participants discuss their first thoughts of the incident. The reaction phase is now participants talk about the worst thing about the incident, what they would like to forget, what was most painful. The symptom phase, teaching phase, re-entry phase. Make sure you read through all of those and understand just in general that kind of pattern or the steps of debriefing. We can use this in a major crisis situation. We can use this in a small crisis situation. Again, this is kind of the process that we should use after a code situation in a hospital. It's sort of the situation that we use and again, your simulation experiences. So just in general, understand that. Okay. I want to just quickly touch on, there's a lot in this chapter, but I do want to touch on the disaster response. It's found on page 499. We're almost done with this chapter. And really, I don't know if how much aware of this I don't know if you're aware of it or not, but I know within our community, and I know this is probably true really in all communities. I'm sure it's true in Lawton and Elk City. But your community planners, your community workers, I'm thinking of the fire department, the police department, hospitals. Here, because we have the Air Force Base, the Air Force Base would be involved too. But they have disaster type meetings where they plan for disaster responses. How will they handle certain situations if it affects the community? And they often carry out, what do you call it? When they actually, have a setup where they pretend maybe one of the chlorine tanks at the Altus swimming pool exploded. And now there's chlorine gas in the air. How will all of our community workers handle that situation to provide safety as much as possible for the people of the community? How will they treat those who are immediately affected? How will they promote safety to the ones who aren't affected? Okay, so that is disaster response, disaster preparedness, and it's becoming more and more, I think people are getting more and more aware of this. It says there is a growing awareness of interdependence that exists among all members of the global community. Each successive large-scale earthquake, tsunami, hurricane, flood, or wildfire has ripple effects regardless of where it occurs. Directly or remotely, we experience some element of the far-reaching depletion of human, economic, and natural resources. Considering the declining values of international stocks, ill-ravaged citizens in Haiti, or the devastation of flood victims in the U.S. Gulf Coast. It's the next paragraph. A decade of 21st century disaster literature supports disaster preparedness by developing resilient communities. There's that word again, resilient, right? When you can handle a problem and bounce back. Resilient means you have good coping skills, good maybe steps in place to handle a disaster. Okay, so these are developed by resilient communities in assessing disaster risk on a local level. Considering the unique forms of devastation connected with any disaster, reducing risk within local communities should be expedient, eventually extending into networking communities and then to larger societal and national programs. If you look down at the 5, phases of disaster management, make sure you kind of understand those. And these were developed in part by FEMA, okay? 1 is preparedness, the protective plan designed before the event to structure the response to assess risk and evaluate damage. So this is done before a crisis ever occurs, before some kind of natural disaster ever occurs. The community is prepared, okay, by working together beforehand to put plans in place. The next one is mitigation. Now this is when the disaster does occur. How is the community going to limit a disaster's impact on human health and community function? Mitigation. And then response. How is the community going to actually respond? How are the different organizations, how are your fire department, your police department, your hospital employees, maybe members of the Air Force Base, how are they going to work together to implement the plan? Recovery then focuses on stabilizing the community, returning to its previous state or status. And then, of course, evaluation is evaluating the response efforts to prepare for the future. Okay, so just understand, I know we don't have a lot of time to go over it, but how, in general, that disaster response works. Okay, let me see. Let me looking at my notes real quick. Okay, I think we're going to go on now. The last one, I don't think I'm going to use a PowerPoint, so I'm going to go ahead and exit out of here. Okay, we won't be very much longer now. We will go through here just for a little bit, talking about anger, aggression, and violence. This is now chapter 27 of your book. We'll be on starting out on page 505. So now we're kind of switching gears and talking about anger, aggression, and violence. Have y'all ever seen an angry patient? Okay. Would you say you almost probably deal to a degree, maybe not on a daily basis, but probably a weekly basis, would you say, dealing with angry patients? Okay. Now there's definitely a difference between anger and aggression. Okay. You can be angry and not be aggressive, right? Sometimes that anger does get maybe out of control, and that anger can turn into aggression. So anger is an emotional response to frustration of desires, a threat to one's needs, or a challenge. It is a normal emotion that can be even be positive when it is expressed in a healthy way. Once anger is acknowledged, challenging anger into productive pursuits such as exercise, art, or cleaning out a closet is healthy. Anger can also be a motivator to try harder or aid in survival when fighting is the last and only resort. Okay. So remember, just this is a side note, but when your patient is in the hospital, okay, are they a lot of those are in maybe a tiny state of crisis, right? Because they are outside of their homeostasis, outside of that normal equilibrium. They're not at home. Okay, so there's a slight bit of disequilibrium going on, even if it's only a minor illness. Also remember that patients in the hospital setting, are they losing a little bit of their independence and control, no matter what? Even if you say, of course, and we're going to promote their independence and promote their any kind of choices that they can make. In general, we're saying, okay, I really do need you to change into your gown. You need to get this hospital gown on, okay? And now at the hospital, we are trying to even help promote more opportunities for them to choose, even if it's just nothing more than having them, they can choose what they have to eat and when they have can eat it. Because we allow at our hospital, I know, for, what do we call it at the hospital? Well, you can call on the phone, you can call the kitchen, you have a menu in front of you, you order what you want, when you want it, as long as you're not NPO, right, or on a special diet, and then within 30 minutes, it will be brought to your room. Versus what we did several years ago when, no matter what, breakfast was going to be served at 7:30, lunch was always served at 8:30, and you may have had a little bit of choice about what you ate, not really, okay? So even that's just one small step that the hospital has chosen to take to try to give a little bit of more independence back to patients, because they are losing some of that when they're in the hospital. And that can make some patients, as they're losing that equilibrium, angry. They may not even recognize it, but maybe they are short with the staff members. And then you add on that, maybe they were able to get up and go to the bathroom normally by themselves, but now they've had surgery. They've had a total knee operation. The nurse is saying you have to ask for assistance to get out of bed. But when you push the call light, maybe it only took you 2 minutes to get to the room, but 2 minutes seems like a long, long time when you're the one lying in bed, okay? So there are just so many things that can cause anger in the patients. Aggression, though, is an act on behavior that results in verbal or physical attack. Aggression tends to be used synonymously with violence. However, aggression is not always inappropriate. It is sometimes necessary for self-protection. If somebody's attacking us, we need to be aggressive back. If they're physically attacking us, if we're, in a parking lot somewhere, at some point, maybe we do need to be aggressive. Okay. But there's a difference. On the other hand, violence is always an objectionable act that involves intentional use of force that results in or has a potential to result in injury to another person. So just understand the difference between aggression and violence. Anxiety, it goes on to say, anxiety is often the precipitant or negative feelings and behaviors. Assessing and responding to this anxiety can have extremely positive returns. It says, refer to chapter 15 for interventions to reduce anxiety before it becomes a crisis. Let's look at that real quick. In your books, keep your finger there, but go back to page 285 and 286. Real quick here. So if we have a patient who's getting anxious, okay, for whatever reason, we need to be able to recognize they're anxious, and then we need to try to intervene before that anxiousness turns into possibly anger, okay? So first of all, on page 284, that is going to kind of help you, that table there, signs and symptoms for anxiety-related, and some nursing diagnosis for anxiety-related disorders. So if you can, I won't take the time to do that, but you can read through those. Those will be the signs and symptoms, how to recognize your patient's anxious. And then what can you do to intervene? Let's read through just a few of those. Help the patient identify anxiety. Ask them if they're comfortable right now. Anticipate anxiety-provoking situations. And we know that the escalation of anxiety to a more disorganizing level is prevented with that. Anticipate anxiety-provoking situations. Use nonverbal language to demonstrate interest, leaning forward, maintaining eye contact, nodding your head. So they need to know you're listening to them when you do talk to them. Encourage your patient to talk about the feelings. Avoid closing off avenues of communication that are important for the patient. Ask questions to clarify what is being said. I'm not sure what you mean. Give me an example. Help the patient identify thoughts or feelings before the onset of anxiety. Encourage problem solving. Assist in developing alternative solutions, possibly through role playing or modeling those behaviors. Explore behaviors that have worked well in the past with the patient. Provide outlets for working off excess energy. Maybe they need to walk or play ping pong, dance, or exercise. Is that maybe just one of the reasons why we have those type of activities? I know a lot of you have been reading your medical reflective journals, your mental health reflective journals. And at Talaferro, you're talking about the recreation therapy that's available to them. And I think is ping pong one of the things that y'all mentioned? I think it was. Anyway, so in one way, that's just a way to even help reduce anxiety. Okay, so anyway, we'll go back to page 505. Under epidemiology, it says the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention reported that almost 60,000 violence-related injuries occurred in 2014. 60,000 violence-related injuries. You're going to be dealing possibly at times with violent patients in the hospital setting. And really in any kind of setting in healthcare, there is that chance of having to deal with a violent patient. It gives you some examples there. I'll let you read through those. Have y'all ever witnessed violence in the hospital setting from a patient? Raise your hands in for Altus if you have. Oh, wait, I can see it. What about everybody? Elk City, anybody ever have to deal with a violent person? No? Okay. I think we should go work in Elk City. It looks like it's a pretty good place no one's violent there. Oh, somebody did raise their hand. Okay. I've definitely dealt with violent people. And a lot of times there was an underlying mental health diagnoses. Oftentimes, because I have worked throughout the years with older patients, I remember specifically, I think the patient was in a delirium state. It was in the ICU. It was probably the first time I dealt with a violent patient. But he scratched my arm really, really bad. And we were doing an x-ray, just trying to send him up for the x-ray. And he just all of a sudden grabbed my arm and just scratched. Oh man, it hurt. I had a scar there for like several months, anyway. I just remember that. And that wasn't nearly as bad as a lot of nurses have dealt with, I know. I know nurses who've gotten punched and hit, scratched, bitten, spit upon, and a lot of times some type of underlying mental health diagnosis is there, not always, okay. But you can read through those different examples in your book. As far as comorbidities, this kind of makes sense, but a lot of times the patients who are violent in a healthcare setting have a history of PTSD and substance use disorders. So be aware of that, y'all know that. Also be aware that patients who do have a higher, they're more often anger, they're more often hostile. That can have an effect on the actual physical body. Those patients are then going to be at a higher risk for heart attacks and strokes. And it says expression of anger in older adults especially predicts a higher prevalence of metabolic syndrome. I'm not sure exactly why, but anyway, that's just kind of an interesting study. Remember that when you're having these bursts of anger that you think the patient can control, sometimes that's not the case. The patient may not be able to control those bouts of anger and aggression and possibly violence. There's lots of genetic and biological reasons, something going on in the brain. What's going on in the brain? Alzheimer's disease is one that's definitely can cause, as it progresses through the different stages, a person to become violent. I'll just briefly mention, I have a cousin who he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. I believe he was probably around the age of 58 or 59. He is now to the point of, his wife could no longer take care of him because of his violent behavior. before all the stages of Alzheimer's occurred, he loved his wife. They've been married several years, not for a long, long time, but I think several years anyway. Kathy is her name. She's the sweetest little thing. I mean, no one could be angry at Kathy. She's just the sweetest personality. And he loved her. Oh, he loves her so much. But as he's progressed through these stages of Alzheimer's, he got to the point to where he was acting out violently toward her. He would try to hit her. And with that being said, he's a cowboy. He's very strong. Even though he has Alzheimer's, he's still very strong. He's only about 62 now, a big guy. And she had to finally put him into a nursing home situation to care for him because she was worried about her own physical safety. He would have vivid hallucinations sometimes, and he would end up trying to hit her. One time he was trying to find a gun to shoot her, and so she finally had to do something about it. But those violent behaviors, he truly was not able to control because of the underlying Alzheimer's, okay? So it says one area of the brain, this isn't under the neurobiological. I'll go ahead and actually read that. Neurological conditions are associated with anger and aggression. These include brain tumors, Alzheimer's disease, temporal lobe epilepsy, and traumatic injury to certain parts of the brain result in changes to personality that could include increased violence. So it's not always in the patient's control. We got to remember that. And I think most of us do. Okay, I know it's hard, but especially when you know that there's an underlying brain injury, underlying brain tumor, underlying Alzheimer's disease, you've got to understand that it's not in the patient's control. One area of the brain associated with aggression is the limbic system. It is located just beneath the cerebrum on both sides of the thalamus. It is responsible for combining higher mental functions and primitive emotions into one system, learning and the formation of memories. And this is definitely affected by Alzheimer's disease. Important structures within this system include the amygdala and the hippocampus. It says the amygdala is the emotional center of the brain. It helps evaluate the emotional content of our experiences. It helps the brain to recognize potential threats and whether to activate the fight or flight response. In animal studies, stimulation of the amygdala produces rage responses, whereas lesions in the same structure results in meekness. That's kind of interesting. So anyway, and again, all of these areas are can definitely be affected by Alzheimer's disease, just as one example. Okay. And it also mentions that the especially large prefrontal cortex, I'm on page 506 now at the top. The especially large prefrontal cortex in humans also plays an important role in aggressive behavior. This area of the brain is responsible for executive function. Executive function allows us to distinguish between good and bad, consequences of actions, goal-directed behavior, and suppressing socially unaccepted behaviors. And again, what I mentioned earlier, that this is being still formed in the adolescent. So, and especially in guys, sometimes it takes a little bit longer for that prefrontal cortex to completely develop. So that is why sometimes you see anger in adolescence, and sometimes that anger coming out in aggression and violence because of the immaturity of the still forming prefrontal cortex. Okay. There's also roles, I'll let you read about that, of serotonin and dopamine. Okay. There's other factors as well. I'll let you read through the rest of that. Again, now, so we're dealing with our patient. We're assessing our patient who maybe has anger and or maybe some aggression, hopefully not violence yet. But when you, so I'm on page 506 under assessment. When the patients are experiencing anger, you often see it manifested behaviorally. What might you see? You might see increased demands, irritability, frowning, redness of the face, pacing, twitching of the hands, clenching and unclenching of the fist are all signs of irritation. Speech may be either increased in rate and volume or slowed, pointed, and quiet. I've seen both of these in patients. I had, not long ago, I was working as house supervisor. I got onto the floor immediately because I think the house supervisor, I was working in the morning. It was about 7:30. I had gotten a report that one of the patients was having maybe some issues with low blood sugar. So that's another thing, right? I just thought about possibly violent behavior, somebody who's hypoglycemic. Anyway, so I went to the room. The patient, he's an older gentleman. He's kind of big. He looks like he could be strong. Anyway, I said, hey, hello, how are you? No, we had not done the blood sugar yet. The nurse was trying to do the blood sugar. He would not let her stick him. So I went into the room to try to intervene. Didn't do so well intervening. I said, we really need to get your blood sugar. And he was like, no, I'm going home. I'm going home now. And I'm like, well, we really do need to get your blood sugar. I was trying to be kind of firm, but still, gentle at the same time. And he was like, look, and he kind of he wasn't talking loud at that point. He was very low. His voice was low and slow. He goes, look, I'm trying to be nice, but if you don't get out of my face, and if you say that again, I'm going to hit you. So I left the room. So, but anyway, that was a sign he was getting very, very angry. It was turning into aggression. He was about to get violent. His voice was not loud. He wasn't throwing things or anything, but he slowly looked at me and stared at me and told me that. So I got out of the room. I didn't leave. I was right outside the door. I was thinking, okay, these are signs of, I was thinking more, of course, yes, he's angry and violent, but he's hypoglycemic. I'm thinking signs of hypoglycemia. He started taking out his IV. So I got the glucometer ready. This probably does not sound like good practice, but got the glucometer ready. And he took the IV out, I asked him not to. Of course, he did anyway. He started bleeding, and I was able to get my blood sugar. And so he was hypoglycemic. He was not going to take food from me, but he had already ordered his meal. So again, I stepped outside because it's like he did not like me, I could tell. But when the dietary, I did give him a Band-Aid. I had opened a Band-Aid. He told me to go back and get a Band-Aid that hadn't been opened. So he didn't trust me. So I brought him a Band-Aid that had not been opened. He opened the Band-Aid. He put the Band-Aid on. Then the dietary lady came in. She had his tray. I kind of stayed out of the way, trying to kind of hide because I know he doesn't really like me. And anyway, she brought the tray in. He was fine with her, and he started eating his food. Within about an hour, of course, he was fine. He didn't apologize to me because he really didn't like me. But he did apologize to the other nurse, saying that he doesn't normally act like that. He knew it was his blood sugar. So again, another example of where I saw the anger turning into aggression and almost violence. But I think I handled it as best as I could in that situation. So that's just one tiny little example of what you might be dealing with, okay? But making sure that you are looking for those signs of irritation, making the unclenching of the fist, the either the speech being loud and accelerating in volume, or maybe being slow, pointed, and quiet. There's a good box on page 27.1. Box 27.1 on page 507. Again, make sure you know those signs and symptoms. Another one, I don't know if it mentions it, but pacing, being really tense and vigilant. Those are another signs of anger and possibly getting to be aggressive. When they're really vigilant. I spelled it wrong, that's why. Vigilant. Always like looking to see if anything's about to happen or going on, okay? So make sure you understand that. When you're assessing, make sure you're assessing their history of violence. That's important. Making sure you're assessing for any trauma. Have they had any kind of physical abuse, child abuse, sexual abuse in the past? That could be a factor in maybe their anger, aggression, and violence. Okay, so make sure you read through how to assess. Again, we always have to self-assess ourselves. And then there's, of course, going on to page 508, making a nursing diagnosis. Some good diagnoses for this would be risk for other directed violence, risk for self-directed violence, ineffective coping, stress overload, impaired impulse control. What are some interventions that we might do? First of all, so I'm on page 508 in that second column, under psychosocial interventions, it is essential to acknowledge the patient's needs, regardless of whether the expressed needs are rational or possible to meet. We need to acknowledge what they think their needs are. We need to let them know that we do expect them to stay in control. That is one kind of intervention. Very calmly. We don't ever need to be rude. Try to always avoid being rude to patients when they're angry. That's hard to do. even when you're, okay, now this sounds silly, but when you're giving report at the end of your shift to the oncoming staff, be careful not to share your actual feelings about the patient, like you're really angry at them because you dealt with their crap all day long. Okay, don't share that feeling with your oncoming staff, because then that staff member may also get that feeling that you're having and may not then intervene correctly as he or she goes into the room. You need to always take the facts, but be careful not to be judgmental about your patient, even in a report. And I've seen this mistake done a lot. A lot of times we'll get report and the patient, the nurse, and it's, I'm not blaming the nurses necessarily. It might be their third shift in a row. They worked 3 nights in a row. They have dealt with the same patient and their problems for the last 3 days, and they've had it up to here. And so they tell you in report, my gosh, this patient's crazy. And their husband, when he comes in, he's just as crazy. They're ridiculous. They're rude. They go through all the negative things. And you just need to be careful how you present that report. Does that make sense? I'm not saying it really well, but I'm just saying that always be professional, because maybe a new nurse coming into the situation may see it a little bit differently and can intervene in a way that turns the patient, maybe changes their behavior somewhat. So, but anyway, always approach the patient in a controlled, non-threatening, and caring manner. If you are experiencing fear, you may find this is quite challenging. Maintaining a calm exterior while your interior is in upheaval requires considerable self-discipline and will come with experience. You need to always try to remain in control, though, even if your insides aren't. Patients who are at risk for violence need much more personal space than those who are not. So allow the patient enough space so that you are perceived as less of a threat. That's very important to do. Allow them their personal space. Always stay about a foot away further than the patient can reach with their arms or legs. That's especially if they're aggressive or violent. You don't want them to be able to reach you. Always do not get into a situation to where the door, that the patient is in between you and the door. Try to avoid, if you can, getting on the other side of the bed to where you'd have to go around the bed to get out of the room. Try to stay on the side of the patient that's nearest the door. This is especially true when you are sitting with a patient. And this is really true if you're sitting with them just because they're a little confused, whether it's a suicidal ideation situation. You really should stay closest to the patient, but closest to the door. Never get around, because I've seen a lot of times I see my sitters when I'm doing house supervisor. I go in to see, oh, how's the sitter doing? And they're sitting in the recliner by the window. So if all of a sudden that patient happens to become violent and aggressive and violent, that staff member may not be able to get out of the room. So protect yourself in these situations, not just the patient. You got to think about staff safety and your own safety. If you see somebody doing that, another staff member, tell them, hey, I really need you to sit here by the door. Okay, that's for your own safety. Okay. When anger is escalating, a patient's ability to process decreases. It is important to speak to the patient slowly and in short sentences using a calm voice. Never yell, but continue to model controlled behavior. That's very important. Again, very hard to do sometimes, but you really should do that. Maybe suggest, let's take a walk and talk. That's one thing that you can do. Sometimes they really need to, when they're getting aggressive, they need to kind of get that energy out. So sometimes taking a walk will help do that. Always be willing to listen to them. So maybe saying, let's take a walk and talk about it would help. Pay close attention to the environment. Choose a quiet place to talk to the patient, but that one that is visible to staff. This is most beneficial in helping a patient regain control. Staff should know you are working with the patient, keep an eye on the interaction, and be prepared to intervene if the situation escalates. At this point, move other patients away, and as much as possible, remove any objects in the area that could be used as a weapon. And I think some of you have probably seen these steps in action at maybe North Texas State Hospital, either probably in Wichita Falls or in Vernon. I've heard a few stories where maybe you weren't actually involved, but you were observationally involved. Okay, so all of those interventions are very, very important. You'll have to always remember your staff safety, not just for you, but for your staff. Okay, read through those. I think you should know all of this. We don't want you to wear dangly earrings. We don't want you to wear necklaces, scarves, especially in the acute care environment. You could easily get your earrings ripped out. Somebody could take a scarf and choke you with it. Okay, stethoscopes. You got to be careful about stethoscopes around your neck, even in the acute settings. Okay, somebody could always, if you had a stethoscope around your neck, they could possibly grab that stethoscope and try to choke you with it. Okay. I think we were kind of reiterating things, so just make sure that you are reading considerations for safety. Read through the the different types of medications that you can give in situations where the patient really is angry and aggressive and becoming violent. Often Haldol is used. Historically, it has been the most widely used first-generation antipsychotic. Second-generation antipsychotics have become more common due to the reduced side effects compared with the first-generation drugs. It also mentions using anti-anxiety benzodiazepines such as Ativan, which is lorazepam, may reduce the amount of the antipsychotic needed. So make sure you're reading through those. Just very quickly, make sure you know how to use seclusion and restraints. That's on page 511 and 512. It does say on the bottom of page 511 there, legally most courts hold that seclusion and restraints be implemented only when a patient creates a risk of harm to self or others, and no less restrictive alternative is available. These measures should never be used for punishment or for the convenience of staff. It's only used after alternative interventions have been tried. Some of these interventions include verbal interventions, offering a needed medication, decreasing sensory stimuli, the presence of a significant other, frequent observation, or one-on-one observation of the patient. And again, over, I'd say the last 10 years, there has been a big move in acute care settings to decrease the use of restraints. In fact, at our hospital, I haven't seen a restraint used in a long, long time. Sometimes if a patient's in ICU on a ventilator, then the wrist restraints are only used there, soft wrist restraints, because we don't want the patient to pull out the ET tube. Otherwise, we just don't use restraints anymore. We use a lot more of our one-on-one sitting, okay? If you do use a restraint, you need to know how to use it. There's a good box there on page 512, 27.3, using mechanical restraints. So I'll just kind of briefly give you the, what do you need to know? You need to always use the least restrictive method possible. You never write a PRN order for restraints. Ideally, you get the doctor's order first. You have to have an order for restraints. If it's a true emergency situation, you can go ahead and put those on and then immediately call the doctor. And then the doctor needs to usually sign those orders within 8 hours. You then, you need to monitor the patient very closely. You'll have to you can read the book and also read your policies of your hospital. I believe our hospital, as far as checking, you have to remove the restraints every 2 hours for about 15 minutes. You may have to be with the patient the entire time at that point. You have to monitor for what we call CMS. What is CMS? Yeah, circulation, motor, and sensory. So if you have wrist restraints on, first of all, how are we going to assess for circulation? Nail bed color, kind of glance down first. Are their nail beds pink? Or and you kind of need to know baseline, right? So make sure, hopefully you've kind of done your assessment prior, you know, that they had pink nail beds and now they're blue. Would that be a concern to you? Yeah, they're like, oh, maybe there's a problem. Maybe these restraints are too tight. I've got to intervene. Can they feel their fingers? If they're able to communicate with you, say, you know, can you feel me touching your finger? How do your fingers feel? What if they say they feel real tingly? That's an odd sensation. That's not good. Maybe those restraints are on too tight. Can they move their fingers normally? Okay. So you need to do that every 2 hours, assessing for signs of circulation, motor, and sensation, making sure that we're not hurting the patient in those areas with our restraints. We need to make sure that we're offering them to toileting needs, addressing toileting needs, addressing food and water. Do they need anything to drink or eat? That should be done at the minimum every 2 hours. And we would need to do it even more, but we need to be doing it every 2 hours. So make sure that you're reading how to use restraints. We need to then get them off as soon as possible. When we really realize that the patient is now calmed down, they're more reasonable now, then we need to go ahead and take the restraints off. Only use them for the length of time needed to maintain their safety. It does say in the middle of page 412 here, delirium or dementia may make seclusion and restraint intolerable due to the absence of stimulation. These restrictive measures should be avoided in patients who are overtly suicidal and those who require monitoring for severe drug reactions and overdoses. That made me think, it's kind of off the subject, but make sure that you're using only tools that are designed for restraints. Only use soft wrist restraints on the wrist, and actually they're extremity restraints, so you can use them on their ankles. If you're having to use a posy vest, I don't have a picture with me, but a posy vest, which we don't really use anymore, but it's a little vest that goes around the patient. The front has a V. It kind of ties around the front, and then you can put it to the back. You can tie that to the bed possibly. You can tie it to a wheelchair possibly, so that they can't get up out of the bed or out of the chair. People in the past have made mistakes. They've put those on backwards so that the back is about right. So the back of the vest is facing on the chest. The back of the vest, of course, is much higher, and it actually comes kind of right across the neck. Then if they slide down at all in bed, what happens to them? They choke to death. People have documented, it has been documented that patients in nursing homes have died because of suffocation, because the posy vest was used and put on backwards and the patient wasn't checked very frequently. So if you're using any kind of device, it has to be used correctly. Do not use a sheet. Even tucking in a sheet too tight around a patient is considered a restraint. I have one time, I'm embarrassed to say it, I came up to the floor, this is long time ago, but a patient was tied with a sheet to a wheelchair. You can't do that. You can only use the appropriate type of whatever restraint. Don't use other things as restraints. A long time ago, nursing was done differently, and I guess I've been a nurse now a long time ago. I mean, a long time, so I can say a long time ago, and I was actually still a nurse then. So anyway, lots of things have changed over the years, okay? With all of this being said, make sure you are charting correctly. There's a good thing on page 513, kind of in the middle there, how to chart. Make sure you're reading that. It says the nurse must provide documentation in situations which violence was either averted or actually occurred. Make sure that you're charting what happened. Be very specific. Okay. I'm going on to patients with marginal coping skills. A lot of times that's the problem with patients and dealing with anger. They don't have good coping skills. And so we need to help them with that. I've written this down. It says a cognitive technique, helping a patient identify a thought that produces anger. So this is a cognitive technique to help a patient develop more coping skills, okay? So we're going to talk with the patient, helping them identify a thought that produces anger. Then we want the patient to then validate that belief. Why is it making them angry? Is there any valid reason why it should be making them that angry? They need to validate that belief. Is it a valid reason or is it not? And then we need to substitute then reality-based thinking. Maybe we need to provide more logic into why maybe this shouldn't really be producing that much anger in the patient. That is just one example of a cognitive technique, helping them identify a thought that produces anger, evaluating the validity of that belief, and then substituting reality-based thinking. We're almost done. I need you to read the rest of it. There's one other thing that I want to tell you about and just remind you of is, again, our patient is not the only one that we're taking care of. We're taking care of family members. So have you ever seen a family member become angry? Probably a lot of you have. One of the worst things, because family members are losing control as well. Remember that. Their equilibrium is becoming a little bit off. It's a little bit of a disequilibrium. One of the things, though, that can, I think, disturb family members more than anything is waiting on procedures to be done, waiting for surgeries to be done. And especially then if there's a problem with, my wife was supposed to go to surgery at 10 o'clock, now it's 11 o'clock, and no one's even come to the room and told me why, or told me that there's a problem. We're trying to figure out what the problem is. Communicating time barriers is so important to our family members. So just remember, that's one thing we need to do is communicate. If it's been 30 minutes, the patient said they were supposed to, I mean, we know the doctor and OR said we're going to come at 10 o'clock to get them, and now it's 10:30. We need to be going to that family member and the patient and saying, I'm not sure what's going on, but I'm going to go ahead and call OR right now and try to figure it out. And then we need to call OR. We need to talk to them and say, hey, what's the problem? And they may say, we just had a car crash, and now we're having victims come in. That's a, could be a good example. Then we need to go to back to the family member and the patient and say, look, there has been a problem. There are some emergency surgeries that are coming through OR right now, and so it's going to be a while. I will try to do anything I can to make you comfortable. I'm so sorry, but this is what's going on. Usually, if you are communicating with the family member and the patient on situations like that, you can really, really decrease any kind of anger type and possible aggressive type behavior that could occur. Communication is key. Okay? I think, oh. I think we're always waiting. I think I'm done. It's noon. So do y'all have any questions anywhere? El Lawton or Elk City?
That's fun.
Okay. Thank you.